At 7 a.m., a man could be seen running, having just completed a 10 kilometers run. From then until noon, he practiced kendo, delivering 500 head strikes to a dummy. By 5 p.m., he headed to the gym for body training under the guidance of an instructor. His workout for the day consisted of 3 major exercises: bench press, squat, and deadlift, each performed for 10 sets of 10 repetitions. Committed to repeating this routine for 14 consecutive days, the man had already submitted his resignation letter to his workplace, deciding to leave his job to fully focus on his regimen. The man recalled someone once asking if he had suddenly gone crazy for resigning from his job just to train his body. Upon hearing this, he wondered that perhaps being crazy might have been the better option. As he pondered this, a system screen unexpectedly appeared before him. The system informed him that the door to the end of days was about to open, and that only 5 seconds remained until the apocalypse. It warned him to prepare for the impending catastrophe, providing him with quests to strengthen himself in order to face the coming disaster. As time ticked down, the timer hit 0, and the end of days finally descended upon the world. 15 days ago, everyone received an urgent message on their phones, warning of a critical disaster. Monsters had appeared near Inwang Mountain. Citizens in the surrounding area were instructed to evacuate immediately to avoid encountering the creatures. Confusion spread as people read the message, with many assuming it was a prank. Just then, a live video from a reporter appeared, confirming to everyone that the monsters were real and the situation was no joke. The reporter, addressing everyone watching his live video, said that since he had come all the way to the scene, he should get a little closer to the monster for a better look. However, at that moment, viewers began spamming the chat, warning him that the monster was right behind him. The reporter dismissed the warnings, believing they were joking, since he had just checked and the monster hadn't moved. But in the next instant, the monster suddenly appeared behind him and killed him on the spot. The reporter's scream startled a man named Lee Ho-young, who was watching the broadcast. As Lee Ho-young walked, he couldn't help but be surprised by how realistic the video looked. Throughout the day, everyone had been receiving disaster alert messages, and he wondered what was really going on. He thought to himself that life was already hard enough without the sudden talk of monsters. Lee wasn't about to believe something so far-fetched. With so many fake videos circulating lately, he was convinced this was just another hoax. But as he looked ahead, he was shocked to see a monster lying on the ground right in front of him. Lee wondered why there was an injured monster lying on the ground in front of him. It was unsettling, and fear crept over him, so he decided to run. Trying to ignore the wounded creature, Lee loudly made an excuse, saying, "I need to get home early, today's the day my math teacher is coming." As he turned to leave, the monster tried to stop him, looking at him with an innocent expression and asking for help. Lee hesitated, realizing the monster was indeed asking for his assistance, but despite its attempt to appear cute, the creature was still far too terrifying for Lee to handle. Lee thought to himself that he was human, while the creature before him was a monster. He wasn't the type of person kind enough to show compassion to a monster, even if it looked at him with innocent eyes. He reasoned that he couldn't help it, no matter how pitiful it seemed. But just then, the monster pulled out a picture of its family, sobbing and gesturing that it wanted to return to them. Seeing this, Lee's resolve faltered, and he couldn't hold back any longer. Despite his earlier reluctance, he decided to help the monster. Later, after assisting the creature, Lee returned home. At that moment, the system notified him that he had received a silver goblin's pill. The system hinted that consuming the pill would grant him something secret and valuable. Lee couldn't believe what had just happened. He had helped a monster and, on top of that, received a gift from it. It didn't seem like something a monster would do, and it left him questioning whether it was truly a monster at all. Curious about the gift, the mysterious pill, Lee also began to wonder about the strange system that kept appearing in front of him. Thinking it might be a hologram, he reached out to touch it. As his thoughts drifted to the pill, he wondered what would happen if he consumed it. Just then, an urgent news broadcast appeared on TV. The reporter announced that large, mysterious buildings had suddenly appeared all over the world. The reporter described them as towers and mentioned that they had lost contact with the U.S. Army, which had entered one of the structures. Upon hearing the news, Lee was stunned by the appearance of both monsters and unknown towers. He wondered if the apocalypse had truly begun. As he held the pill in his hand, an explosion suddenly shook the area outside his house. People were screaming, fleeing in panic from the source of the commotion. Then, everyone stopped in their tracks, frozen in shock as a massive tower emerged out of nowhere. At that moment, the news reporter announced that a huge tower had also appeared in Korea. Lee, seeing the tower so close to his home, clenched his fist. Without hesitation, he decided to consume the pill given to him by the monster. Lee wasn't sure if the decision he was about to make was the right one, but this was his only chance to do something as crazy as consuming a pill from a monster. In that moment of uncertainty, he swallowed the pill. Instantly, a massive surge of power coursed through his body. The system appeared again, informing him that he had unlocked the Sage status window, which would give him the highest chance of survival in the current situation. Just then, particles resembling pieces of a puzzle began to gather and form a glowing, radiant book. Lee, still in shock, reached out his hand. To his surprise, he found himself holding the luminous book. As soon as Lee opened the book, a brilliant light erupted from its pages. The system reappeared, informing him that the door to the end of days was about to open, with only 15 days, 4 hours, and 12 minutes remaining. It urged Lee to prepare for the impending catastrophe and recommended that he begin training his body. At that moment, the system presented Lee with a quest that included strength training, cardio exercises, and learning kendo, tasks he needed to complete in the time leading up to the end of days. At that moment, Lee decided to heed the system's instructions. Time passed, and he committed himself to the guide's recommendations. He gave up everything else and devoted the next 15 days solely to training. As the countdown ended, the door of the end opened. Upon seeing the system notification, Lee was surprised. It was quite different from what he had imagined. Suddenly, a blunt sword materialized in front of him, leaving him astonished. The system then announced that the game had officially begun and that it was now time for the tutorial. It also informed Lee that the aptitude test had been completed, and based on its data analysis, he would be assigned the most suitable class for his abilities. The system then announced that Lee had been assigned the class of combat swordsmanship. He was taken aback to receive such a class. Following this, the system instructed him to open his status window for more details. However, when Lee opened it, he was overwhelmed by the sheer volume of information that popped up. There was too much to read at once. As he scanned the status window, he noticed that he was a level 1 swordsman and had a level 1 skill in basic swordsmanship. The status window also displayed his stats: stamina, strength, agility, and sensitivity, all at low levels since he was just starting out at level 1. Lee stood up, picked up his sword, and felt a surge of excitement at being designated a combat swordsman. He realized that this was the moment when everything would truly begin. At that moment, the system displayed a list of objectives he needed to complete. He had to choose at least one of the two options presented. The first was to survive in the forest he was currently in for 60 minutes, and the second was to find the exit and escape. Lee thought to himself that if this was meant to be a tutorial, it should provide him with time to adjust to the game before things really started. Lee then opened the guidebook in his system, which informed him that he needed to use the full 60 minutes of the tutorial to defeat as many monsters as possible. The guidebook also noted that choosing the second option, finding the exit, would hinder his growth and was therefore not recommended. Lee was surprised to discover that he could access the Sage status window during the tutorial as well. At that moment, he realized that the Sage status window had prompted him to exercise because it anticipated that situations like this would arise. Based on the guide's advice, Lee realized he had to hunt the monsters in the vicinity, so he decided it would be best not to run away from the forest. Just then, the system announced that the tutorial had officially begun, and at that moment, a small monster appeared in front of him. Lee was taken aback. The creature was a level 1 one-horned raccoon and surprisingly cuter than he had expected a monster to be. However, in an instant, the raccoon transformed, displaying a vicious expression as it lunged at Lee. Reacting swiftly, Lee slashed the monster effortlessly, dispatching it without any difficulty. At that moment, the system announced that Lee had successfully killed the one-horned raccoon and gained experience for his effort. Since the monster had fallen to a single strike from his basic swordsmanship, Lee concluded that it was very weak, just a typical tutorial monster. He noticed that using his basic swordsmanship had consumed 2 magic power points. With only 10 magic power available, this meant he could only use the technique 5 more times. Realizing this, Lee understood that he needed to conserve as much magic power as possible while hunting for monsters. As Lee continued to defeat numerous monsters, he finally leveled up to level 2. Not only that, but he also regained his health and magic power with the level increase. The system then informed him that he would earn points each time he leveled up, which he could use to enhance his stats. Excited by this revelation, Lee felt grateful for the level up, especially since his magic power was nearly depleted. However, just as he was reveling in his progress, Lee noticed something strange: the system was beginning to fade away. In that moment, the system explained that because he possessed the Sage's status window, he would level up more slowly compared to other players. Lee was left feeling both puzzled and intrigued by this new information. Lee was taken aback by this revelation, realizing that there was a penalty associated with having the Sage's status window. He couldn't believe that the level he had just gained came at such a cost, and he began to wonder when he would be able to level up again. Frustrated by what he perceived as an absurd handicap, Lee decided to call upon his status window to display his stats. However, upon examining the information presented, he was puzzled by what he saw. Something felt off, and he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something wrong with his stats. Upon examining his stats, Lee was surprised to find that he still had points available. At that moment, he thought to himself that if his assumptions were correct, this wasn't a penalty at all, rather, it was an overpowered, bug-like ability. Although he had fallen back to level 1 as expected, his remaining points continued to increase. Lee realized that the more he leveled up, the more experience he would need for the next level. He concluded that raising his stats this way would be easier than leveling up through normal means. Determined, he decided to focus on enhancing his stats. As he looked at the options available to him, he saw that he had 4 choices to make. Lee considered that boosting his strength and agility would be the best choices for a combat swordsman. Strength would enable stronger attacks, while agility would enhance his speed and reflexes. However, he realized that the stat he needed most at that moment was sensitivity, so he decided to allocate points to increase that stat. As he continued to defeat the one-horned raccoons, Lee reflected that the monsters in the vicinity were relatively weak, merely tutorial monsters. He was able to defeat them easily with his default stats. The challenge, however, was that finding enough one-horned raccoons within the given time limit would be difficult, limiting his opportunities to further increase his stats. This was why Lee had chosen to level up his sensitivity stat, and as a result, it had become much easier for him to locate the raccoons now that his sensitivity was heightened. Just as he was contemplating his situation, a system notification popped up, informing him that he had defeated all the monsters in the area, which activated a hidden quest. At that moment, a massive level 2 monster, identified as the one-horned raccoon Alpha, appeared behind him, glaring at Lee with vicious anger. Lee, taken aback, wondered what kind of formidable creature stood before him. At that moment, the one-horned raccoon Alpha launched itself at Lee with a powerful attack, but he barely managed to dodge it. Lee noted the monster's impressive speed and began to wonder if it was the boss of the tutorial. He took a moment to calm himself and assess the situation. Upon closer inspection, Lee realized that this monster was distinctly different from the other one-horned raccoons he had fought and defeated. While he acknowledged that the Alpha was indeed more powerful than its predecessors, he also understood that defeating it was still within his reach. Determined, Lee prepared to confront the formidable creature before him. After a few moments, the system notified Lee that he had successfully defeated the one-horned raccoon Alpha. Not only had he completed the hidden quest, but he had also received gold as a reward. The system then confirmed that Lee had officially finished the tutorial. Reflecting on the experience, Lee thought to himself how unexpectedly long the 1-hour tutorial had felt, though he was relieved that it was finally over. However, as he opened his eyes, Lee was stunned to find himself in an entirely different place. To his shock, he was now standing among a group of other people, unsure of where he was or what would happen next. At that moment, a booming announcement congratulated everyone present for successfully completing the tutorial. The announcement went on to explain that they were now in the lobby of the tower, located in the C-2567 region. Lee felt confused by the mention of a lobby and wondered what it could mean. As he took in his surroundings, he noticed 14 men and 11 women nearby. Curiosity sparked within him. He began to wonder if they had also completed the same tutorial and had been transported here just like him. Lee observed the situation and noticed that most of the people around him were in a state of panic. He thought it was understandable. After all, the entire world had changed in just a day. Reflecting on the chaos, he realized that if he hadn't known beforehand about the impending apocalypse, he too would likely be caught up in the fear. Determined to stay composed, Lee reminded himself that he needed to focus on surviving this ordeal. Just then, a woman spoke up, asking where they were. Before anyone could respond, a small figure approached and explained that they were in the tower known as the Tower of the End. As the woman looked down, she was taken aback to see a talking rabbit answering her question. The rabbit introduced itself, stating that its name was Kumkum and that it was the manager of the lower floor of the tower. Everyone gasped in disbelief, bombarding it with questions about how it had appeared out of nowhere. Some wondered if it was a child in a rabbit suit, while others asked if it was responsible for bringing everyone to the tower. Kumkum sighed, thinking to itself that such reactions were entirely normal for newcomers. Amid the commotion, Lee stepped forward and addressed Kumkum directly, expressing his desire to know one thing. If this was truly the end of the world, what were all the people supposed to do now? Kumkum, hearing Lee's question, nodded and replied that it was indeed an excellent inquiry. Kumkum then smiled menacingly and informed everyone present that all 22 players in the lobby of the tower would be participating in a life-or-death game. The gravity of Kumkum's words sent shockwaves through the crowd, leaving everyone stunned at the realization that their lives were at stake. Kumkum continued, explaining that all humans on Earth were currently within the tower and that they would need to work together for each mission and floor they aimed to climb. Hearing this, Lee raised his hand and asked Kumkum if they would be able to return to their normal lives once they reached the top of the tower. Kumkum, with a playful grin, replied that it, too, had no idea what would happen when they finally made it to the top. Upon hearing Kumkum's response, Lee asked what the purpose of climbing the tower was. Kumkum replied that there was no need to search for meaning in such matters, Lee simply had to do what he was told. The rabbit ominously added that only death awaited those who refused to climb the tower, mentioning that a significant number of people had already perished during the tutorials. At that moment, panic washed over Lee as he realized the grim reality of the situation. He had not considered that people could actually die, and even though it was just a tutorial, he knew there were many who might have struggled to complete it. At that moment, Kumkum spoke up, asking if anyone was willing to try and kill him, explaining that his death was necessary for them to return home. He added that those who assisted him would receive a special reward. The announcement left everyone shocked and confused, while Lee couldn't shake the feeling that it might be a trap. Kumkum didn't seem very strong, but Lee quickly realized that there was no way he could defeat a creature that was level 55. Deciding it was best to stay back and observe for now, Lee hesitated. Just then, the system notification popped up, instructing him that he needed to help Kumkum, the lower floor manager, get home. Lee contemplated how he would assist Kumkum in reaching home and whether it was acceptable to attack him. Although he had always found it beneficial to heed the guide's advice, Lee wondered if it was worth engaging in something so suspicious. Confusion washed over him as he struggled to decide on a course of action. Just then, one of the other participants stepped forward, declaring his willingness to help Kumkum reach home. With a smile, the man told Kumkum that if it wanted to die so badly, he would gladly oblige. Lee realized he was too late to offer his assistance, watching as the man brandished his sword, warning Kumkum not to regret it, promising to deliver a painful death. Just as the man was about to swing his sword at Kumkum, the rabbit's expression shifted dramatically. In an instant, Kumkum delivered a powerful blow to the man's head, severing it from his body and sending it flying backward. The gruesome scene left everyone in shock, paralyzed by fear. Kumkum, now wearing a sinister grin, remarked that it had been an accidental counterattack. The other participants screamed in terror, unable to process what they had just witnessed. Lee stood frozen, too frightened to move, realizing that he could have met the same fate had he offered to help Kumkum with his request. Kumkum, trying to regain control of the situation, insisted that the earlier incident had been a mistake and asked for another volunteer. However, no one believed him. Panic-stricken, they scattered away from the rabbit in fear. Lee found himself questioning whether the guide had deceived him. Kumkum extended his hand once more, pleading for someone to help him return home, but the gruesome display had left everyone unwilling to step forward. In that moment of uncertainty, Lee wondered why the guide would mislead him. He decided to consult the guidebook again and discovered another ability he possessed: the Sage's Eyes, in addition to the Sage's status window. This ability would allow him to trigger the Sage status window and view the status of other players, providing valuable insight into their abilities and intentions. Lee wondered why another ability had appeared alongside the Sage's status window and where it had come from. Curious, he activated his Sage's Eyes on Kumkum. A smile crept across his face as he realized how to assist Kumkum with its request. As Kumkum continued to plead for help, Lee stepped forward, declaring his willingness to aid the creature. In that moment, he felt reassured that the guide hadn't misled him after all. Kumkum looked at him, noting his low level, and remarked on it. But Lee quickly interrupted, insisting that level didn't matter when he was about to perform a good deed. Kumkum, grinning menacingly, acknowledged Lee's words, agreeing that he was indeed correct. Kumkum urged Lee to send him home quickly. Just as Lee was about to draw his sword, a woman interrupted him, cautioning that it was too dangerous, especially after witnessing someone die moments earlier while trying to fulfill Kumkum's request. The others chimed in, agreeing with her and urging Lee not to act recklessly. However, Lee interrupted them, assuring them it was fine because he had a plan for the situation. He promised that they were about to witness something exciting. Confusion spread among the crowd as they wondered what kind of plan Lee had in mind. At that moment, Kumkum charged at Lee, but Lee remained calm and unafraid. As he stood his ground, he realized something strange about Kumkum's earlier statement. Lee was certain there had been 25 people in the lobby, yet Kumkum announced that only 24 players would participate in the game with their lives on the line. Initially, Lee considered the possibility of a mistake, but then he dismissed that idea. It became clear to him that this was a test, a way for the others to confront their fear of facing a level 55 monster and the very real threat of death. Kumkum's mention of the wrong number was intentional. There had only been 24 players in the lobby to begin with, and the person who had just died was merely a hologram. At that moment, everyone was shocked when Kumkum delivered a powerful blow to Lee. However, Lee remained unfazed. He realized that not only was the man who had just died a hologram, but Kumkum was also merely a hologram, which meant it had no actual attack power. This revelation came to Lee when he used his Sage's Eye skill to examine Kumkum's stats, confirming that it posed no real threat. Kumkum, realizing that Lee had figured everything out, acknowledged him with a nod of respect. "You're quite perceptive," he said. "For those like you, who possess courage, may the odds be ever in your favor." With that, Kumkum vanished into thin air, leaving the players in a state of awe. Upon Kumkum's disappearance, it dropped a reward for Lee, a green ball pill, onto the ground. In that moment, everyone realized that Kumkum had been just a hologram all along. Someone then asked Lee how he had figured out that Kumkum was a fake. Lee explained that he had coincidentally noticed that the blood had passed right through Chai Yizal, the woman who had earlier warned him about Kumkum. He went on to say that, given her proximity to the person who had just been killed by Kumkum, her face and clothes should have been covered in blood. This made Lee suspect that everything was just an illusion. Upon hearing this, Chai Yizal touched her face and realized that Lee was right. There wasn't a single drop of blood on her. At that moment, a huge man named Kim Seong, who was level 4, stepped forward and approached Lee. Seong told him that it would be a huge waste for Lee to keep the reward dropped by Kumkum. He remarked that Lee had just been lucky to figure it out and added that if he had noticed earlier, he would have done the same thing Lee had. Curious, Lee asked Seong what he meant by saying it would be a waste for him. Seong then explained that the fact Lee was still only level 1, even after completing the tutorial, meant he was either incredibly weak or unable to kill anything. He suggested that Lee had likely passed the tutorial by simply running away rather than fighting. Seong then added that Lee was going to die soon anyway, so for the sake of mankind, he he was giving Li the chance to yield the reward and hand it over to him. Li, shocked by Seong's arrogance, couldn't believe he was serious. In that moment, Li made a decision. Right in front of Seong, he used the reward and gained a stat point. Seong was stunned, unable to believe that Li had blatantly defied him. Li then calmly told Seong that yielding wasn't something he did, and he had no intention of ever yielding to him. Furious, Seong stated that Li was just a bottom feeder, accusing him of acting this way only to save face because he was still just a lowly level 1. In that moment, Li thought to himself that, based on his experience, the wisest course of action would be to avoid people like Seong. However, he wondered how long he could keep that up. Just then, an announcement rang out, informing everyone that their starting gold would now be distributed. They were told that they could use the gold in the shop, and in addition to the base amount, extra gold would be awarded based on the number of monsters each person had killed during the tutorial. The announcement also mentioned that the highest amount of starting gold earned by a player in their area was 7,400 gold. Everyone was shocked to hear that someone among them was going to receive 7,400 gold. Seong, irritated by the announcement, regretted not performing better in the tutorial and killing more monsters. Another person, Kim Junsung, remarked that while he didn't know who had come in first, whoever it was must have been incredible. No one knew who had come in first, except for one person, Li himself, who had earned the 7,400 gold for killing the most monsters in the tutorial. Li decided to keep this fact to himself, knowing that revealing it would only attract more trouble. After all, Seong was already envious over a single stat point. As Li opened the shop, he reflected on the 3 ways the gold could be used. First, to buy items. Second, to level up skills. And third, to increase one's stats. At that moment, Li invested half of his gold into leveling up his stats, raising his strength, stamina, agility, and sensitivity to 20 points each. While Li focused on his shop, Seong was fuming, frustrated by the high cost of leveling up skills. Noticing Seong's irritation, Li decided to upgrade his own basic swordsmanship, spending 1,500 gold on it. He also bought new clothes, as he didn't want to keep wearing his gym uniform. Just then, Chai Yizal approached Li and said she wanted some advice from him. Surprised, Li asked why she would seek advice from someone like him, who was still just level 1. Yizal responded by telling Li that she didn't care about his level, but was instead impressed by his bravery. Li was taken aback by her unexpected compliment. Curious, he used his skills to check Yisol's stats. After looking them over, Li asked her how much gold she had. Yizal replied that she currently had 800 gold. When Li heard Yisol's response, he thought to himself that she was being honest, as she hadn't lied about how much gold she had. At that moment, he decided to hide the fact that he was using a cheat key. Changing the subject, Li asked Yizal if she liked exercising, to which she replied that she didn't mind walking. Li then remarked that, in that case, her stamina was probably not very strong. Yizal agreed with his observation. Li advised her to focus on improving her stamina first, explaining that without it, she wouldn't be able to use items effectively, no matter how much gold she spent. Feeling motivated, Yizal thanked Li for his advice and said she would follow his suggestion. At that moment, another announcement echoed, stating that the first floor mission would commence soon. Players were advised to form their own 3-person parties, and those without parties would be randomly assigned to one. They had 3 minutes to make their decisions. Hearing this, Li realized that while he had anticipated a group mission, he hadn't expected it to come so soon. Junsung then spoke up, suggesting that since they could see each other's levels, everyone should also share their classes. Following his lead, the players began to reveal their classes, and soon teams started forming as individuals chose whom they wanted to party up with. At that moment, Yizal asked Li if he would be willing to team up with her for the upcoming group mission. With that, Yizal became Li's first party member. He had no reason to refuse, especially since having a healer like Yizal on his team was a significant advantage. However, the others were not as accommodating. One by one, they rejected Li's proposal to form a group. Li couldn't help but think that, despite having a healer, they might have been deterred by his status as a level 1 player. He realized it was understandable that no one else wanted to join their team. After all, a level 1 combat swordsman wasn't exactly an appealing choice. Lee noticed that the players had already started forming teams with others at the same level, and as he observed them, he realized that the only people left without a team were the very ones he wanted to avoid. After a few moments, an announcement rang out, stating that the 3-minute period had ended and that incomplete parties would now be filled randomly. It also mentioned that the first floor mission was about to begin. Seong, now forced to be in a group with Lee and Yizal, grumbled that he was very unlucky to be teamed up with a bottom feeder like Lee. Lee couldn't help but think that he wasn't thrilled about partnering with Seong either, but he never imagined that Seong was even more unpopular than he was, despite being a level 4 player. Seong, looking at Lee with an irritated expression, snapped, asking what Lee was staring at and telling him to go away. Hearing this, Lee wondered if it would even be possible for him to cooperate with Seong. However, he resolved to make it work, telling himself that he needed to find a way to collaborate with Seong in order to survive in the tower. Just then, the system notification appeared, announcing that their mission was to annihilate the Kobold tribe and that they had 12 hours to complete it. As the three of them roamed the forest, they finally came across the Kobold tribe's base. Seong glanced at Lee and declared that he would wipe out the Kobold tribe, instructing Lee not to get in his way. In response, Lee reminded Seong that this was a team mission, not a solo endeavor. Seong's anger flared, and he called Lee a loser, insisting that Lee was merely riding on his coattails and had no right to comment on the situation. Lee sighed and retorted that he would indeed try to ride on Seong's coattails and see just how good that was. Lee decided to listen to Seong for the time being. Seong remarked that Lee had intended to ride on his coattails from the very beginning, questioning why Lee was acting so defiantly. He added that Lee should only get his act together when someone was about to kill him. In response, Lee sarcastically thanked Seong for his concern. Meanwhile, Yizal looked worried, wondering if their party would be able to hold it together. As they approached the Kobold tribe's base, Seong complained about the abundance of bugs in the area, while Lee, irritated by Seong's behavior, thought to himself that they needed to complete the mission without any further complications. As they walked, Lee looked up and noticed the abundance of bugs around them, realizing that being in the mountains meant they could expect a lot of them. At that moment, Yizal called out to Lee, asking if the kobold monsters were strong. Lee replied that they might be stronger than the one-horned raccoon, but since they were still at level 1, defeating the kobolds should be manageable. He also cautioned Yizal to remain on guard, reminding her that they were in the Tower of the End, where anything could happen. Yizal nodded in agreement, acknowledging the validity of Lee's warning. As they approached a kobold, Lee noticed it was level 5 and observed its muscular build from top to bottom. He was surprised. This kobold was vastly different from the previous monsters they had faced in the tutorial. Yizal also spotted the kobold and remarked that it was clearly stronger than the other monsters, asking Lee what they should do in this situation. Lee suggested they check their surroundings first, as there might be more kobolds hiding nearby. However, just as he was speaking, Seong stepped out into the open, accusing Lee of hiding instead of confronting the monsters. He charged at the kobold and delivered a powerful blow to its head. Lee and Yizal were shocked to see Seong step out into the open and confront the kobold directly without any plan. While Seong's blow did connect, it failed to inflict significant damage on the creature, which glared at him with fury. Undeterred, Seong launched a flurry of attacks against the kobold. Lee couldn't believe Seong would charge in and fight the monster so recklessly. He hadn't expected Seong to be this stubborn. As Lee pondered the situation, Yizal announced that she would also help Seong by healing him during the fight. Lee felt a sense of relief that no other kobolds were nearby, otherwise, they could have been in serious trouble. As Lee observed the fight between Seong and the kobold, he recognized that Seong was putting his level to good use. With Yisol's healing support, Seong might even be able to defeat the kobold on his own. However, Lee was surprised at how low the damage from Seong's attacks was compared to his strength, leading him to wonder if the kobold had some hidden weakness. He decided to consult his guidebook for assistance. Upon checking, he discovered that kobolds were passive monsters and would only attack when provoked. Reading this, Lee realized that Seong had stirred the hornet's nest for no reason. Trying to focus on the positives, Li thought that capturing a few kobolds for research purposes was still worthwhile, so their confrontation wasn't entirely unproductive. Just then, as he continued to flip through the guidebook, he stumbled upon information that could aid them in their fight against the kobold. At that moment, Seong activated his level 1 skill, Stone Fist, and aimed a punch at the kobold. However, he missed and instead struck a nearby tree, which broke and fell right on the head of another kobold, this one level 6 and stronger than the one Seong was currently fighting. Regret washed over Seong as he realized the consequences of his actions. As the newly angered kobold charged at him, he felt a wave of panic. He was about to be in serious trouble. Turning to Li for help, Seong was frustrated to find that Li was no longer there. He thought to himself that Li might have run away out of fear. Just then, the kobold swung at Seong, but fortunately, Yizal was able to block the attack and assist him. However, as she tried to warn Seong to be more careful, she accidentally slipped and fell to the ground. In that precarious moment, the kobold prepared to deliver a powerful strike toward Yizal. Believing it was all over for her, Yizal braced for impact. But at that instant, Li rushed in from behind, hurling an unusual-looking fruit into the air. He deftly sliced the fruit, releasing its juice onto his sword just as he swung at the kobold. The blade connected, dealing massive damage and instantly killing the creature. In that moment, a notification from the system appeared, confirming to Li that he had successfully eliminated a level 6 kobold. Both Seong and Yizal were taken aback to see that Li had managed to kill the kobold with a single slash of his sword. Li smiled, realizing that he had discovered something important. While the bugs feasted on the fruits growing on the trees, the kobolds had left the fruits untouched. This struck Li as odd. Curious, he opened his guidebook to learn more about the fruit he had just used. To his surprise, he discovered it was a poison apple. The guidebook also noted that kobolds were particularly vulnerable to poison. It advised Li to gather these fruits from the mountains and use them strategically in his battles against the kobolds. Li realized that the key to completing the level 1 mission was to use the fruits against the kobolds. Seong, irritated by the outcome, watched silently. Meanwhile, Li approached Yizal, offering his hand and asking if she was okay. She assured him that she was fine and thanked him for his help. Li then explained to Yizal that he hadn't expected another kobold to be drawn there due to the aggro. He added that it would have been dangerous if he had arrived just a moment later. Yizal told Li that, regardless, he had arrived just in time to help her, and she was grateful for his assistance in such a dangerous situation. She then asked him where he had disappeared to. Before Li could respond, Seong interrupted, angrily labeling Li a free rider. He accused Li of hiding in a corner during the danger and only swooping in to steal the final hit on the kobold after Seong had already landed several blows. Li was bewildered by Seong's accusations, while Seong continued to berate him, claiming that Li had acted unethically by stealing the stat points that rightfully belonged to him for defeating the kobold. Seong then turned and walked away, asserting that, as a higher-level player, he would be the bigger person and let the matter slide. Li, however, couldn't help but think Seong was delusional. Without his intervention, Seong would have found himself in serious trouble or worse against the kobold. Seeing Seong's behavior, Li thought to himself that Seong clearly couldn't read the room, and he was only making things harder for himself with this attitude. Moments later, in the kobold village, Seong was exerting himself fully in an attempt to defeat the kobolds, but it was futile. He was dealing far too little damage to make any significant impact on the monsters. As the kobolds continued to inflict damage on Seong, he thought to himself that the monsters seemed relentless. Meanwhile, he observed Li and Yizal effortlessly defeating the creatures, their movements fluid and confident. Seong couldn't help but wonder how they managed to take down the monsters so easily while he struggled and took a beating. With each passing moment, as he endured more blows from the kobolds, Seong's injuries worsened, and he eventually found himself on the ground, crying and begging for help. Overwhelmed by the pain and desperation, he pleaded for someone to rescue him from this dire situation, unable to endure it any longer. Just then, as Seong was crying, he felt the relentless beating stop. Looking up, he saw that the kobolds that had been attacking him were now dead, slain by Li and Yizal. Li approached Seong, extended his hand, and said with a grin that he had taken over the coattail ride in Seong's place for a little while. He then playfully asked Seong how the ride was now that he was in charge. Seong's face lit up with happiness, and he exclaimed loudly, calling Lee his big brother, overwhelmed with joy that Lee had saved him from the kobolds. Both Lee and Yizal were taken aback by Seong's sudden change in attitude, and at that moment, the system notification appeared, announcing that they had successfully cleared the mission. A few moments later, the three of them returned to the lobby. As Seong reflected on his earlier actions, he regretted having bowed to Lee and declared that he would serve him from that point on. It irked him to think that he had referred to a newbie like Lee as, Sir. Seong glanced at Lee with irritation, especially since Lee was only level 2 while he had already reached level 8, and yet, it was Seong who had been saved by him. He worried about the consequences if this information got out, but Seong, determined to uphold his pride as a man, resolved not to back down from his earlier words. His irritation began to resurface once again. Lee, meanwhile, observed Seong making strange faces and thought that he might need to go to the restroom. Yizal, scanning her surroundings, noticed that the lobby was empty, leading her to conclude that they might be the first ones to complete the mission. Lee chimed in, noting that it seemed they had indeed finished the mission faster than anyone else, thanks to their fortunate discovery of the kobolds' weakness, which had allowed them to defeat the monsters with ease. Seong, taken aback, couldn't believe that they were in first place and had finished the mission ahead of everyone else. At that moment, Yizal told Lee that it wasn't luck but rather his keen observational skills that had allowed them to be the first to complete the mission. She added that she would never have thought to use the poison from the fruits against the kobolds. Lee acknowledged this, saying that without Yisol's support, it would have been much harder for him to handle the monsters. As he spoke, other groups of players began emerging from the gate after completing their missions. Lee remarked to the two of them that it looked like the other parties were returning as well. He wondered if those parties belonged to Junsung and Junho and speculated that they might have discovered the poisonous apples, too. Lee felt a bit of concern, hoping that the other parties would make it back to the lobby safely. At that moment, one player announced that another party had made it back alive and successfully completed the mission. As they observed the returning players, Yizal asked about the third member of their party, noting that only 2 had emerged from the gate. The player, tears in their eyes, responded that those 2 were the only ones who had made it out alive. Just then, an announcement echoed through the lobby, declaring that the first level mission had been completed by all the parties. Upon hearing this, Yizal shouted that there was still someone unaccounted for from the gate. The announcement was repeated, confirming that a total of 6 parties had returned alive, while 8 players had failed to make it back. Lee was shocked upon hearing this announcement. He had anticipated that it would be difficult for everyone to return alive, but he was taken aback to learn that 8 people had already perished in the first level. Lee wondered how many more would die before they reached the top. The announcement continued, stating that the calculation for the level 1 mission would now begin and that the parties who had returned whole, as well as those who had cleared the first level first, would each receive 100 gold. At that moment, Lee realized he had earned 2,000 gold from both bonuses. Although this amount was somewhat lacking compared to the tutorial rewards, gold represented a form of insurance for Lee's future survival, and he felt a sense of satisfaction at receiving it. At that moment, Lee thought to himself that he needed to save as much gold as possible. While he was deep in thought, he heard a voice asking which group had been the first to complete the mission. Lee realized he had to reveal this information, especially since the party that returned second already knew that he and his team had been the first. However, just as he was about to speak up, Seong stepped forward and proudly announced that their team had completed the level 1 mission first. Seong boasted that it was an obvious outcome, claiming that he and his team had always expected to be the frontrunners. He then told the other players not to be disheartened by their loss. Everyone was taken aback to learn that Seong's party had been the first to complete the mission. Seong, noticing their astonishment, questioned why they couldn't believe it and implied they were just jealous for not securing first place. The others clarified that their disbelief wasn't rooted in jealousy but rather in the fact that Lee, who was only level 2, was part of their team. They looked at Lee with disdain, pointing out that he had received 2,000 gold for essentially doing nothing, warning him not to get too carried away. As the crowd continued to criticize him, Lee began to feel increasingly bothered by their remarks. Just as Yizal was about to speak up and explain that their victory was thanks to Lee, he quickly interrupted her, assuring her it was fine. He pointed out that the others wouldn't listen to their explanation anyway. Instead, Lee resolved to demonstrate his worth through actions, believing that mere words wouldn't convince them. At that moment, Junsung stepped in, urging everyone to calm down and reminding them that they needed to prioritize their survival over petty arguments. At that moment, Kim Junsung, already at level 8 and an archer, was one of the highest level players in the region. Seo Junho, also level 8 but a combat swordsman, echoed Junsung's sentiment, emphasizing the importance of moving forward. He added that they must continue to push on in honor of those who had lost their lives. Everyone felt motivated by Junsung and Junho's words, rallying together as they shouted to shake off their despair and prepare for the challenges ahead. Just then, the blue flames illuminating the lobby flickered out, replaced by ominous red flames. An announcement echoed through the area, warning everyone present of an impending danger. Confusion swept over the crowd as they tried to grasp what was happening. At that moment, an announcement was made informing everyone that the survival rate for the first level of Region C2567 was below average. As a result, a penalty mission was being enforced. The news left everyone confused and shocked, realizing they were about to face a penalty mission. Just then, another announcement followed, declaring that the death mission would soon commence. The announcement continued, instructing the players to silently choose one candidate in their minds, with the individual receiving the most votes being selected for the death mission. They were given 5 minutes to decide. The players were stunned by this revelation. It was also declared that failing to choose someone would result in an automatic vote for themselves. In that moment, everyone understood that being chosen meant certain death. As panic spread and everyone scrambled to decide who they would choose for the death mission, Yizal stepped forward and suggested that if they all voted for themselves, no one would have to take on the mission. Someone immediately challenged her, pointing out that there was still a possibility they could all end up doing the death mission if no one was selected. Another player interjected, saying this wasn't the time for arguing, as time was running out. Just then, one of the players pointed at Lee, casting their vote for him to take on the death mission. Yizal was stunned, while Lee remained silent. At that moment, Junho stepped forward, apologized to Lee, and stated that, in the end, they still had to choose someone for the death mission. Lee told Junho that, given the atmosphere, he had expected this outcome, but he was still taken aback as he didn't want to die. Hearing this, Junho felt bad for Lee but knew there was nothing he could do. Yizal then addressed the group again, insisting it wasn't too late and suggesting that if everyone voted for themselves, they might still escape the mission. However, Lee interrupted her, saying it wouldn't work. He pointed out that Lee Jaechial's reasoning was valid, as no one could be sure Yisol's plan would succeed, and trust had already been broken. He added that their best option was to vote for one person. As time continued to slip away, more and more votes accumulated for Lee. The number of votes above his head steadily increased, and he knew why. The biggest reason was simple. He was low level, making him an easy target. Everyone had abandoned the belief that the strong should protect the weak. As Lee reflected on this, Yizal, furious, stepped forward and confronted the group, accusing them of being cruel. She couldn't believe they would do this to someone like Lee. One player responded by asking what they were supposed to do if not vote for Lee as they didn't want to die, and a choice had to be made. Another player added that it didn't matter if they voted for Lee, as he was going to die anyway due to his low level. At that moment, Lee realized that everyone's masks had fallen away, revealing their true selves. Just then, Seong approached him, smirking as he cast his vote for Lee to take on the death mission. In that instant, Lee understood. It was a harsh reminder that the end of the world had truly arrived. As time ran out, an announcement declared that all votes had been cast, and the portal to the death mission was opening. Lee now stood before the gate, preparing to enter. At that moment, Seong spoke up, remarking that, in hindsight, Lee's death would solve Seong's problems. Feeling satisfied, Seong added that he was a genius for voting for Lee. Lee, reflecting on the situation, thought of himself as the chosen sacrificial lamb, with the altar now prepared. Behind him, he sensed the faces of guilt and relief, knowing he had no choice but to face the death mission. But in that moment, Lee reminded himself that this wasn't a death mission for him. The guidebook he had read advised him to take part, as he had a high chance of clearing it, with a satisfactory reward awaiting him. Smiling, Lee stepped into the gate, knowing this wasn't the end but rather an opportunity. A short while later, back in the lobby, Yizal sat on the ground near Seong, looking depressed and worried about Lee. Junsung approached her and asked if she was all right, adding that, though their time together was brief, they had all watched each other's backs. He expressed regret over parting with Lee in this way. Seong interrupted Junsung, saying there was no reason to feel regret because Lee had gotten what he deserved. Confused, Junsung asked Seong what he meant by that. Seong then explained that Lee, being a low-level player, had only tried to benefit from Seong while they were in the same group, and that Lee had been carried by him the entire time. Hearing this, Yizal challenged Seong, pointing out that it was thanks to Lee's abilities that they had been able to complete the first mission so easily. Seong shouted at Yizal, insisting that Lee had no real abilities and had merely gotten lucky. He claimed that Lee had only delivered the final blow to the monster after Seong had already weakened it. Yizal was taken aback by Seong's lies, knowing full well the truth of what had happened. She confronted Seong, asking if what he said was genuinely true, as she distinctly remembered Lee saving Seong when he was on the verge of dying. In that moment, Seong found himself unable to respond to Yizal. Seong began to reconsider his thoughts and realized that Lee had indeed been responsible for killing most of the monsters. This made him wonder if Lee had a skill that allowed him to conceal his true level. As he contemplated this, Seong grew anxious, questioning whether Lee would actually die in the death mission and hoping that he would make it out alive. Junsung then told the two that he hoped Lee was as capable as Yizal had portrayed him to be, because if he truly was that good, there was a chance he might survive the death mission. With tears in her eyes, Yizal recalled Lee's words, expressing his determination to show everyone that he deserved their respect. Wiping her tears, she assured Junsung that she believed in Lee and that he would return safely. Junsung, upon hearing this, smiled and agreed with Yisol's sentiment. Inside the gate, Lee surveyed his surroundings and noticed that the corpses littering the ground were those of the kobolds he had killed earlier. This sight sent a shiver down his spine, making him feel uneasy. Shifting his focus, Lee opened his guidebook, reminding himself that he would have voted for himself if things hadn't gone in his favor. He reassured himself that it was fortunate everything seemed to be going his way, though he felt a twinge of annoyance at Seong. After all, Seong had acted friendly during their first mission but had betrayed Lee without hesitation as soon as the opportunity arose. At that moment, the system informed Lee that the Kobold tribe's hunting group had returned, and the death mission was about to begin. His objective was to kill the chieftain and the enraged hunting group, furious over the deaths of their tribesmen. The chieftain, a level 12 kobold, let out a deafening roar, directing its fury at Lee. Immediately, the rest of the kobolds charged at him, determined to finish him off. However, Lee already knew their weakness and like the others, the chieftain was vulnerable to poison. He planned to fully exploit this advantage. As Lee faced the charging kobolds and the level 12 chieftain boss, he realized it would be nearly impossible for any other player to complete this mission. In a similar situation, most players would have accepted their fate, but this time it was different as he was the one confronting these monsters, and he had no qualms about facing them. Dousing his sword with poison from the apple, Lee swiftly slashed through each kobold that charged at him, taking them down with ease. With all the side characters defeated, he knew that the only opponent left to face was the chieftain boss of the kobolds. Lee charged toward the chieftain boss, eager to test how this formidable opponent would fare against him. As he swung his sword at the chieftain, he was taken aback when the chieftain managed to block the attack. Lee was surprised by this turn of events, realizing that the chieftain had minimized the impact by retreating at the moment of contact. Just as he was contemplating the boss's impressive skills, the chieftain suddenly turned and fled. Lee was astonished that the chieftain boss was running away from him. As Lee chased after the chieftain boss, who was fleeing in panic, he felt disappointed that a boss monster could be so weak. He mused that this would all be over soon. As he swung his sword, he began to think that the death mission might actually be a bonus stage anyone could clear. Just as he was about to deliver the final blow, his sword suddenly couldn't pierce the chieftain's body anymore, leaving Li bewildered by the unexpected turn of events. At that moment, the chieftain turned to face the full moon, and something within it awakened. With newfound strength, the chieftain unleashed a powerful attack, slashing at Li's right shoulder. In the lobby, Seong stood proudly, declaring that since they could do nothing about someone who was already dead, he would carry everyone to the remaining floors. Yizal, however, ignored Seong's words and focused on praying for Li's safe return. Seong, noticing her indifference, grew annoyed and told Yizal that Li was already dead, making her prayers pointless. Yizal, furious at Seong's callousness, retorted that even in a world like this, he should at least have some conscience. Seong was taken aback by Yisol's response. She then asked him what he would do if Li managed to return safely. However, Seong interrupted her, asserting that there was no way Li could survive the death mission. As Yizal and Seong argued, Yizal suddenly noticed someone emerging from the portal of the gate. When everyone turned to look, they were shocked to see that it was none other than Li. Junsung stood in disbelief at Li's appearance, while Junho beamed with joy at the sight of him alive. At that moment, an announcement echoed through the lobby, informing everyone that the player Li, who had participated in the death mission, had returned alive. With a smile, Li assured everyone that he had made it back safely. A few moments earlier, Li had been slashed across the chest by the chieftain and was on the verge of death, with very little health remaining. He realized he needed to stop the bleeding while also delivering one decisive blow to end the chieftain's life, but he didn't know how to achieve that. As the chieftain launched a powerful attack at Li, he managed to dodge it, albeit with great difficulty. At that moment, Li had a sudden realization. He thought that while a sword might not be able to cut through a wall, a nail could pierce it. He recognized that he had been viewing the sword solely as a slashing weapon, but he could also use it to attack the monster in various ways. At that moment, Li decided to try something new. He thought about using the momentum of the monster as it rushed toward him, combined with his own weight, to pierce through the monster's body. As the chieftain delivered a powerful attack, Li concentrated all his strength at one point. Utilizing both the monster's momentum and his own, he successfully pierced through the chieftain's body, ending its life. Just then, the system appeared, notifying Li that the skill stabbing had been added to his level 2 basic swordsmanship. Simultaneously, it informed him that he had completed the death mission. Back in the present, Yishol rushed toward Li to give him a hug, but at that moment, she was pushed aside by Seong. In a panic at seeing Li alive, Seong embraced him and expressed his faith that Li would return safely. Both Li and Yishol were taken aback by Seong's behavior. Seong, terrified yet relieved, thought that no mere death mission could prevent Li, the strongest in the universe, from coming back. Meanwhile, Li felt annoyed by Seong's actions and wanted to beat him for it but managed to hold back. At that moment, one of the players asked Li if he had really cleared the mission. The player expressed his relief at seeing Li safe but pointed out that if Li had successfully completed the mission, he would have gained a significant amount of experience points. To everyone's surprise, Li's level remained unchanged, and he was still a level 2 player. This led the group to question whether Li had truly finished the mission and if it was similar to the previous encounter with the rabbit, which had turned out to be just a hologram. At that moment, Li reflected on his past and realized that the world wanted the weak to remain weak. He recalled how he was mistreated in school, even when he scored the highest marks in his class through hard work. Despite his efforts, no one believed him. They always assumed he was cheating and referred to him as a pathetic orphan who resorted to dishonesty. Even in his current situation, everyone continued to doubt Li, believing that he had simply hidden a way to let time run out and complete his mission without taking any action. Another player suggested that this theory made sense, reasoning that someone as low-level as Li would be incapable of facing the monsters directly and must have completed the mission purely by luck. Hearing this, Li understood that prejudiced people rarely change their perspectives easily. Frustrated by their remarks, he felt anger rising within him but chose to remain calm and refrain from acting out. Just as Li was about to speak, Yizal intervened, urging everyone to stop speaking thoughtlessly. She reminded them that they should no longer doubt Li's skills, as he had already demonstrated his abilities by surviving the death mission. As Li watched Yizal, Seong stepped in, asserting that she was right. He further emphasized that not only had they failed to hold a celebration for Lee's glorious return as the strongest in the universe, but they had also dared to ruin the mood. Seong declared that they had lost their minds by doing so. Lee looked at Seong in confusion, questioning his intentions and thinking that Seong seemed the craziest among everyone present. Despite this feeling, Lee couldn't help but smile, reassured that there were still people standing in his favor. Lee thought to himself that he needed everyone to survive in the tower, regardless of their opinions about him. To accomplish this, he realized he needed to show them something convincing. He then spoke up, stating that he had something to demonstrate. At that moment, Lee drew a red sword known as the Indomitable Sword, which was classified as rare and boasted an attack power of plus 15%. Everyone was surprised to see that Lee possessed a rare ranked sword with such impressive attack power, considering it a cheat key. Junsung expressed his astonishment, noting that Lee had managed to keep the poison apple and commenting that Lee was as extraordinary as Yizal had claimed. Lee, however, modestly replied that he was just lucky. Junsung remarked that the valuable item Lee had acquired was far more significant than mere survival experience, serving as crucial help for their survival. However, Lee reminded them that they had nearly driven him to his death, causing a wave of panic among the group. Junho then stepped forward, agreeing with Lee's assertion. He explained that he had initially justified their decision to send Lee into the death mission, believing it was unavoidable. However, he recognized it was pure selfishness to think it was acceptable as long as it wasn't him facing the danger. Junho pointed out that despite knowing that voting for Lee, the player with the lowest level, essentially targeted him, they had still thrown Lee into a deadly situation for their own self-preservation. Juno bowed his head towards Lee and sincerely apologized for what he and the others had done. With tears in his eyes, he expressed how truly glad he was that Lee had managed to return alive. As Lee observed Junho's humble apology, another player, Seo Yoonjin, interrupted, telling Junho that he didn't need to go this far since someone had to face the mission anyway. She added that Lee had come back alive with a rare item, so everything turned out fine in the end. Junho, hearing Yoonjin's words, was furious and questioned how she could speak to Lee that way. Junho told Yoonjin that she should at least feel a slight sense of guilt towards Lee. Yoonjin smiled and reminded Junho that he had no right to say that to her since he had also voted for Lee to face the death mission. At that moment, Lee intervened and explained that he had brought up their actions not to reprimand them but to prevent such situations from recurring. He pointed out that during the death mission voting, the tower was trying to divide them, provoking distrust and causing conflicts, likely enjoying their path to ruin. Everyone was shocked to hear that, and at that moment, Lee added that he believed his return from the death mission was an opportunity for them. He explained that he had already proven their actions could defy the tower's intentions, so they needed to work together. Upon hearing this, Junsung asked Lee if he had a plan for the future. Lee responded that he would search for ways to ensure the survival of as many people as possible while continuing to climb the tower. He emphasized that they would all ascend together, and someday, when they reached the top, they would be able to return to their normal lives. Everyone, upon hearing Lee's words, agreed and felt motivated to climb the tower and face the dangers together. Yizal emphasized that to achieve this, everyone present would need to join hands and work together, which received unanimous agreement. Junho was impressed by Lee, recognizing him as a generous man for expressing such sentiments despite having been betrayed by them all. He reflected that they should not have judged Lee based on something as trivial as his level. Just then, Kumkum arrived and interrupted them, stating that it was unfortunate that their next mission would be a survival game. Everyone was taken aback to see Kumkum, as they had assumed he had left. One player speculated that he had returned to grant them stat points once again. Lee then asked Kumkum what he meant by a survival game. Kumkum explained that the level 2 mission would involve the 15 players present in the lobby, turning it into a battle royale. Everyone was taken aback by this revelation. Sensing their shock, Kumkum reassured them that since the mission was low level, it would only be a mild challenge, so they need not worry too much and should cheer up. He then proceeded to explain the rules. In the level 2 mission, there would be 16 players along with 16 doppelgangers, making a total of 32 participants, and their objective to clear the mission was to eliminate all the doppelgangers. Kumkum explained that the doppelgangers would possess not only the same stats but also the same memories, making it harder for the players to identify them. He then emphasized that the most crucial rule was rule number 3, there would be no reward for killing a doppelganger. However, Kumkum added that if a player managed to kill another player, they would receive stat points and gold as a reward for their actions. Kumkum explained that this mission presented an opportunity for them to increase their levels. However, everyone disagreed with him, feeling that he was essentially encouraging them to kill each other. Kumkum then added that if no kills occurred within 30 minutes, everyone would be summoned back to the lobby and face a tremendous disaster. To illustrate his point, Kumkum summoned a monster of unknown level in front of them, demonstrating the threat they would face if they failed to eliminate someone within the time limit. Everyone was shocked to see the formidable monster standing right in front of them. At that moment, the monster launched a massive attack toward the players, who managed to dodge it. However, the attack left them speechless and filled with fear, as even a single strike from the monster posed a disaster-level threat that could end their lives at any moment. Everyone was terrified as they faced the formidable creature. One player struggled to comprehend that they were expected to confront such a monster, especially after barely passing the first floor. Panic engulfed the group, leaving them unsure of what to do. Lee realized that the situation was dire. With everyone in a state of panic, it would be even more challenging for them to work together. At that moment, the monster unleashed a powerful punch toward one of the players, who was frozen in fear and unsure of how to react. Just in time, Lee intervened and saved the player from the impending blow. The player expressed gratitude for Lee's timely rescue, but Lee found himself wondering why the monster was attacking them before the second-level mission had even begun. In that instant, Lee realized that the monster was acting intentionally, putting on a show to ensure they all took the upcoming mission seriously. At that moment, Lee realized that this was just a glimpse of what lay ahead. The monster was not merely trying to intimidate them. However, just as he was processing this thought, the monster unleashed a powerful attack that sent 3 players flying through the air, injuring them in the process. Confused by the turn of events, Lee struggled to grasp the situation. As the remaining players launched their attacks, it became clear that their efforts were futile. Their strikes were too weak to inflict any damage on the monster. No matter how many times they hit it, the monster remained unharmed. Frustrated, Lee felt that this incident had been meant for show, only to discover that the monster was genuinely trying to kill them before the mission even began. At that moment, Yizal informed Lee that she was running low on mana and would soon be unable to heal the injured players. Lee recognized that, while no player had died yet, their luck wouldn't hold out for much longer if the situation continued like this. Just then, the monster prepared to unleash a powerful attack, but Lee quickly called for everyone to step back, declaring that he would handle the situation. Junho urged Lee to get away from the monster, but Lee realized he had no time to worry about others' opinions. If he couldn't stop the monster's attack right then, everyone would be doomed. At that moment, Lee channeled all of his remaining power, combining his indomitable sword with his stabbing skill. He gathered every ounce of his energy and delivered a powerful strike against the monster, completely eradicating it. Everyone was shocked by what they had just witnessed, and even Lee was surprised by his own actions. At that moment, cheers erupted as the players celebrated the defeat of the monster. However, Lee found himself questioning whether the sword he had used was truly that powerful. Just then, the system notification appeared, informing Lee that he would be in an exhausted state for 3 minutes due to exerting strength beyond his limits. At that moment, Lee felt completely drained and collapsed immediately. 3 minutes later, the system notified Lee that his exhaustion had been lifted, and he finally awoke from his sleep. Everyone gathered around him, filled with concern for his well-being and admiration for what he had accomplished against the monster. Junho, overwhelmed with emotion, wept tears of joy and expressed his disbelief at how humble Lee remained despite his immense strength. He even praised the dramatic fainting gesture Lee had made in his final moments, calling it flawless. As Lee rose to his feet, he asked the group what had happened to him and the monster they had been fighting. At that moment, Kumkum approached, brimming with excitement, and informed Lee that the monster had been sent back. He added that this encounter was merely a warning, giving everyone a glimpse of what awaited them if they failed to follow the mission's rules. Lee immediately realized that the monster had been nothing more than a provocation, meant to show the players the consequences they would face if they didn't adhere to the guidelines. At that moment, Kumkum remarked that things weren't as exciting as they should be, pointing out that everyone was being far too friendly with each other, despite having narrowly escaped death just moments earlier. He went on to remind them that the rule requiring a kill every 30 minutes meant that those standing nearby might very well be the ones to turn on them. As he spoke, Kumkum's face twisted into a sinister expression, and the group was gripped with fear at the unsettling truth of his words. Kumkum then announced that, having delivered its message, it was time for it to take its leave, bidding everyone farewell with a cheerful expression. Lee, seething with anger, was outraged that the creature would so openly reveal its intentions in front of them all. He silently questioned whether there was anything they could do about the situation. Moments later, Junho spoke up, warning that if they couldn't identify the doppelgangers, they would eventually be forced to kill one another, and that was something he desperately wanted to avoid. Another player chimed in, urging the group to find a solution quickly before it was too late. Lee then stepped forward and suggested that they mark each other, so they could easily tell the difference between themselves. One player, hearing this, pointed out that it was said the doppelgangers shared memories, raising the question of how they would deal with that. After some careful thought, Lee spoke up again, telling the group that he had an idea that could help them complete the mission. Curious, everyone asked what it was. Lee confidently responded that he would be the one to handle killing the doppelgangers. Everyone was stunned by Lee's bold declaration. He continued, explaining that they should all remain inactive and gather at the highest point on the second floor. He added that if anyone other than him attempted to kill, they should assume that person was a doppelganger and unite to defeat them. A player named On Sachang, who was at level 9, questioned if that was Lee's entire plan. Yoonjin then spoke up, acknowledging Lee's impressive skill despite being a lower-level player, but expressed confusion as to why they should follow his plan without question. After hearing Yoonjin's doubts, Lee asked if she remembered what Kumkum had told them earlier. He reminded her that Kumkum had mentioned there was no reward for killing a doppelganger, but players who killed each other would gain stats and gold. Lee then explained that while the instructions seemed to focus on defeating the doppelgangers, the tower's real intention was to push them into killing one another. He expressed his frustration, saying he no longer wanted to be manipulated by the tower, and believed this was the best course of action. Yoonjin questioned how that could be the best solution, but before she could continue, Junsung interrupted and voiced his agreement with Lee's plan. Junsung told the group that by following Lee's plan, they could minimize the damage they might suffer. Yoonjin was surprised by his support. Junsung then added that since Lee had taken on the responsibility of killing the doppelgangers, it likely meant he had a way to distinguish between players and doppelgangers. He said this while looking at Lee seriously. Lee smiled and confirmed that he did have a method to tell them apart. Moments later, an announcement echoed through the area, signaling the start of the second-floor mission. The players were given 30 minutes to kill at least one person. Lee glanced at his guidebook, which notified him that he was the first player to reach a certain stat level in sensitivity. As a reward for this achievement, he received a new skill called Impeccable Senses, which would help him identify the doppelgangers. Relieved, Lee felt a weight lift off his shoulders, especially since he had been nervous after boldly claiming he could distinguish between players and doppelgangers. The timely appearance of this skill felt like a stroke of luck. Although he was pleased with the new ability, Lee couldn't help but feel a bit regretful, knowing he had invested many stat points to level it up. After investing heavily in his sensitivity stat, Lee finally raised it to 50, unlocking the skill, Impeccable Senses. With this skill, his 5 senses became highly refined, allowing him to gather detailed information about anyone within a certain radius. Lee was thrilled to have acquired the ability, even though it had cost him nearly half of his gold. It felt as if his entire world had been enhanced, with every sound, sight, and sensation sharpened. As he reveled in this newfound clarity, Lee suddenly heard a voice in the distance, thanks to his heightened senses. Looking toward the source, he saw Seong approaching him. Seeing Seong approach, Lee felt a surge of excitement, amazed that he could hear him speaking so clearly despite being 500 meters away. However, that excitement quickly turned to disgust as a foul smell wafted from Seong. Unable to endure the terrible stench, Lee instinctively covered his mouth. As he focused on Seong, he immediately recognized the truth. Seong was not a player but a doppelganger. As Seong walked, he couldn't believe that Lee had asked everyone to gather at the top without taking any action. Despite being the one who suggested it, Seong thought the plan was still too reckless. He lamented his dislike for climbing mountains, but just then, Lee approached him. Seong instinctively hid behind a tree, but Lee smiled and pointed out that Seong was a big guy, making it unrealistic to think he could hide effectively behind such a small tree. Seong laughed shyly at Lee's comment and expressed his relief at seeing him, admitting that he had thought Lee was just a doppelganger. However, just as Seong finished speaking, Lee suddenly slashed him in two in that very moment. At that moment, a system notification appeared, informing Lee that he had just killed one of the doppelgangers, leaving 15 doppelgangers and 16 players remaining. The message reiterated that a player must kill someone within 30 minutes. After killing the doppelganger, Lee realized it had behaved like a real person right up until the moment it died, and he felt a twinge of regret for his actions. However, he chose to push those feelings aside, feeling relieved that he could now confidently identify which individuals were players and which were doppelgangers with the help of his new skill. Lee hoped that the rest of the players were following his instructions as well. Lee felt relieved that, with Junsung's support, everyone had agreed to follow the plan he had proposed. However, a sense of worry lingered in his mind, as he knew that anything could happen in real time. He hoped that nothing bad would occur until everyone reached a high point on the map they were in. Just then, as Lee contemplated the other players, a system notification appeared, informing him that one of the players had died. Lee was shocked by the news he had just received. Lee was stunned that a player had already died in such a short time. He wondered whether the doppelgangers had begun killing players or if another player had committed the act. Curiosity gnawed at him as he tried to identify the culprit responsible for the death. Realizing there was no way to determine what had happened in that moment, Lee began to run hurriedly, knowing he needed to find the killer as quickly as possible. Lee climbed a tall tree, feeling frustrated that as soon as he killed a doppelganger, another player had died immediately afterward. He wondered where the real killer could be. Using his enhanced senses, he noticed two players in the distance, one of whom lay lifeless on the ground. As he observed the standing figure, Lee realized it was the doppelganger. Determined, he decided to approach it to deliver the killing blow. As Lee approached the doppelganger, he realized it was Go Yongwoo, who looked frightened at the sight of him. Without hesitation, Lee slashed the doppelganger, and it fell lifeless, vanishing into thin air. At that moment, the system announced that another doppelganger had been eliminated. There were now 14 players still alive and 13 doppelgangers remaining. Lee reflected that while he suspected the doppelganger might be the killer, the reality was different from what he had expected. Regardless, he felt a sense of relief that he had killed the doppelganger before it could cause any further harm. At that moment, Lee looked at the player lying on the ground, whose name was Lee Byung-chul, and prayed for his soul to rest in peace. However, as he examined the dead body, Lee noticed something strange. The doppelganger of Ji-yu Yongwoo that he had just killed had carried a dull long sword, but Byung-chul's body did not bear any sword wounds. Instead, Lee realized that the injury on the deceased player was caused by an arrow. At that moment, Lee realized another player was standing in the distance, aiming an arrow in his direction. Troubled by the presence of another potential culprit close to the scene, he quickly hid behind a tree. As he focused on the archer, he recognized Junsung. Upon closer inspection, Lee noticed that Junsung was injured, with an arrow embedded in his shoulder. Lee concluded that the injury might have been caused by Junsung's own doppelganger. Lee approached Junsung and asked if he was all right. However, upon seeing Lee come closer, Junsung raised his voice, telling him to stop. Although he didn't want to be suspicious of Lee, he had no way of knowing who was a doppelganger and who was a player, so he insisted that Lee maintain a safe distance. Lee pointed to the doppelganger that was disappearing and explained that he had just killed it. He added that this would serve as enough evidence to prove he was not a doppelganger. Seeing the doppelganger vanish, Junsung breathed a sigh of relief, knowing that the Lee in front of him was the real one. He then warned Lee about the doppelganger that looked just like him. However, at that moment, Junsung suddenly collapsed to the ground. Lee was shocked and rushed over to check on him. A few moments later, as Lee helped Junsung move, Junsung apologized, expressing regret for letting the doppelganger escape. He admitted that, if he had acted differently, the other players might not have died and apologized for the trouble he had caused everyone. Junsung then added that the thought of another person who looked like him going around harming others was horrifying. However, Lee reassured Junsung, telling him not to worry about that. He emphasized that they were all victims of the tower and needed to focus on escaping alive. At that moment, Lee heard two people approaching, and soon after, Junho and Yizal called out to him. Yizal, relieved to see both Lee and Junsung safe, expressed her worry upon hearing that a player had died. Junho echoed her concern, stating that he was also worried and couldn't believe that two players had already lost their lives. Yizal asked Junsung if he was hurt and offered to help him heal his wounds. However, Lee abruptly released Junsung and warned him to stay away, revealing that both Junho and Yizal standing in front of them were doppelgangers. Junsung was in disbelief at the accusation, but as Junho and Yizal realized that Lee knew their true identities, their expressions shifted, and they charged toward Lee with the intent to finish him off. Junho, wearing a menacing smile, told Lee that he was saddened to think that Lee still held a grudge regarding the death mission. He added that he had believed Lee to be a big-hearted person. As the two were locked in combat, Junsung shouted to Lee, saying he would handle the doppelganger that took the form of Yizal while Lee focused on Junho. While fighting against his opponent, Lee wondered why these two doppelgangers were confronting him so boldly, especially since one of them possessed Yisol's memories. He thought that Yizal would understand that he was strong enough to defeat both of them easily. Just then, Yizal attacked Lee from behind, shocking him because her doppelganger was supposed to be dealt with by Junsung. Junho also attacked Lee, and as Lee dodged both of their strikes, an arrow flew toward his head, which he narrowly avoided. At that moment, Lee turned to see Junsung aiming his bow at him, wearing a menacing smile. Junsung then remarked that it was a pity Lee had managed to evade the attack because he believed he had Lee in checkmate. Kim Junsung, age 35, was an archer whose previous occupation had been a fisherman in Wanyang, and his hobby was human fishing. At that moment, Junsung admitted he had unintentionally spoken in dialect due to his excitement, forgetting to conceal his true personality. Junsung, gazing at Lee, asked him what emotions he was experiencing at that moment, inquiring if he felt betrayed, futile, or deceived, all while laughing menacingly. In response, Lee chuckled and told Junsung that he had been wondering when he would reveal his true colors, adding that Junsung was crazier than he had initially thought. Junsung, upon hearing this, asked Lee if he was implying that he had known all along about the backstab. Lee replied that he had already suspected Junsung's intentions, as he could see the status windows of other players. Noticing that Junsung's stats had significantly increased, Lee realized that Junsung had murdered the other two players and received gold and stats for those kills. Junsung, upon hearing Lee's words, remarked that Lee was becoming more interesting as time passed and asked if Lee had received the favor of the tower, expressing his jealousy. Lee then urged Junsung to skip the small talk and questioned him about his motives. Lee asked whether Junsung desired gold and stats so desperately that he would resort to killing others. In response, Junsung stated that he didn't need a reason. In a beautiful world like this, killing people came without penalties and instead brought rewards. He questioned why he should refrain from killing when it benefited him, and at that moment, Junsung shot an arrow toward Lee. At that moment, Lee wondered if there had been a situation that led Junsung to behave this way, but he realized he had been mistaken about him. Fueled by this revelation, Lee charged toward Junsung. He considered that Junsung had merely worn a mask, holding back until now, revealing himself to be a murderous psychopath. While charging at Junsung, Lee skillfully dodged all the attacks from the doppelgangers, but managing to fend off all three of them at once proved to be a challenge, forcing him to retreat for a moment. Lee, assessing his situation, recognized that the team he was facing comprised the best close combatant and healer in the area, along with a ranged attacker stronger than both. He realized this combination left him with no openings, making it difficult to deal with them. Lee then remarked to Junsung that he didn't understand how Junsung managed to convince the two doppelgangers, but it seemed he had prepared extensively. Junsung replied that to achieve a big catch, significant preparation was necessary. He added that he had expected Lee to go down much easier, but was surprised to discover how tough Lee truly was. Junsung smiled menacingly and told Lee that it was fortunate Lee could hold out against them, as it would allow Junsung to enjoy watching Lee struggle painfully until he ultimately perished. Junsung then commanded the two doppelgangers to raise the nets, signaling that it was time to catch their prey. At that moment, the two doppelgangers charged at Lee while Junsung released 3 arrows from his bow. Lee activated his impeccable senses, becoming more focused than ever. Lee thought to himself that the team he faced was undoubtedly an exceptionally well-balanced party. As he checked their stats, he noted that all 3 opponents were incredibly strong. However, Lee reminded himself that overwhelming strength meant little against a skilled opponent. At that moment, he swiftly killed the 2 doppelgangers. The system then notified Lee that 2 doppelgangers had died. Seeing this, Lee slowly approached Junsung, who was now panicking at the turn of events. Junsung, witnessing Lee's approach, fell to his knees, crying, and begged Lee to spare his life, expressing his fear of dying. Junsung then confessed that he had become obsessed with the rewards and had lost control for a moment, growing impatient after witnessing Lee's exceptional skills. He acknowledged that this impatience had caused him to cross a line he should never have crossed. Junsung begged Lee to spare his life just this once. However, as Lee drew closer, Junsung quickly pulled out one of his arrows and swung it at Lee. Lee easily deflected the attack and, in that instant, swung his sword, cutting Junsung in half. As Junsung died, he realized that he had caught a fish too big for him to handle, and in that moment, his life came to an end. The system then informed Lee that a player had died, leaving 13 players still alive and 11 doppelgangers remaining. In that moment, Lee regretted having to kill a living human. However, the system then popped up again, revealing that the player who had taken on the challenge of becoming the star player had died, and Lee would now have the opportunity to become the star killer in their place. Lee was shocked by this revelation. The system also explained that if Lee ultimately became the star killer, he would receive tremendous benefits. At that moment, a mysterious being appeared in front of Lee, extending her hand, while the system prompted him with a question about taking up the challenge. Lee was taken aback by the surreal scene unfolding before him. The system informed Lee that if he accepted the challenge to become the star killer, he would receive a boost to his stats along with the support of the doppelgangers. Lee took a moment to calm down and realized that this was the reason Junsung had been able to command the doppelgangers. Setting that aside, Lee examined the benefits of becoming a star killer and was astonished by what he would receive. He discovered that by taking on the role of a star killer, he would gain legendary rank equipment, a legendary rank skill, a rapid increase in stat points, and an exclusive star killer trait. Lee was astonished by how incredibly good the benefits were. He thought about how, although he disliked the idea of killing doppelgangers, he was able to cut through them because he knew they were not human. He also recognized that he would encounter more situations where he had to fight actual humans, including the possibility of facing another challenger aiming to become a star killer. This challenger might even be the real future star killer. Tempted by the benefits, Lee took a moment to reflect and ultimately decided to refuse the offer. He reminded himself, while recalling Junsung, that he did not want to become a crazed psychopath like him. At that moment, as he turned away, Lee noticed the other players waving at him from a distance, and he felt a bit of happiness seeing them. However, his mood quickly shifted when he spotted the ugly face of Seong, who was acting cute and playfully asking Lee why he was late. This interaction made Lee reconsider his decision, and he thought to himself, while trying to hold on to his resolve, that perhaps it would be a good idea to turn into a crazed psychopath since he could hardly bear to see Seong's expression. After a few moments, Lee addressed everyone, commending them for their successful gathering. He acknowledged that it must have been challenging to follow his proposal and expressed his gratitude for their cooperation. One player, standing next to his doppelganger, then inquired about their next steps now that they were assembled and asked Lee if he could truly identify the doppelgangers. Lee then assured them that he could indeed differentiate the real players from the doppelgangers. Just as he was speaking, another voice interrupted, expressing gratitude for everyone's adherence to his instructions. Upon hearing that voice, Lee instantly recognized it as his doppelganger. The others were taken aback by the sight of 2 Lees and were left bewildered about which one to trust. One player then asked if Lee had anticipated this situation as well. At that moment, Lee realized that things had become complicated, which was why he had wanted to eliminate his own doppelganger before arriving at the location. However, his plan had been disrupted by an unexpected variable, Junsung. Lee then reflected that he was now engaged in a chess match against his doppelganger. One player remarked that he was unaware of the current situation and requested that Lee explain what was happening. The player also inquired whether Lee had killed the previous doppelgangers and asked for the identities of the deceased. At that moment, Lee realized that there were a total of 8 individuals who were either dead doppelgangers or dead players. He understood that if he revealed the 5 doppelgangers he had killed, everyone would naturally deduce their identities. Lee then realized that if he could prove this fact, he would be able to demonstrate that he was a player. However, there was a complication. Both he and the doppelganger were fully aware of the identities of the deceased doppelgangers. In an unexpected turn, both Lee and the doppelganger mentioned the names simultaneously, leaving everyone even more confused about which Lee was the real one. At that moment, Lee felt dissatisfied that the situation had come to this. At that moment, Lee's doppelganger urged everyone to think carefully about the situation. He explained that Seong and Yizal were in Lee's party on the first floor and had built a strong trust among themselves. Lee's doppelganger also mentioned that he was the first to discover them and had eliminated all the other doppelgangers. He then posed the question of how likely such an event could be. In that moment, Lee realized that his doppelganger had made the first move to convince everyone that he was the real Lee. One player then questioned whether this was a trick to put Lee at an advantage. Another player argued that the trick was too obvious, but a third player pointed out that there was no guarantee it wasn't possible. Lee's doppelganger then raised his voice, stating that if what the other Lee had said was true, it meant that Junsung standing nearby was the doppelganger, implying that the other Lee had killed the real Junsung himself. Lee's doppelganger declared that Junsung was the highest level among them, a true leader who inspired courage during the toughest times. He argued that it was impossible to imagine someone like Junsung dying and added that even if the Lee standing beside him was the real one, none of them could trust someone who had just killed Junsung. The group was deeply shaken by the doppelganger's words. Sensing the growing unease among them, he allowed a sinister smile to creep across his face. Inwardly, he admitted he had no idea how the real Junsung had died, but he could see the momentum shifting in his favor. Lee's doppelganger thought to himself that the only task remaining was to solidify his position. Seizing the moment, he accused Lee of being too impatient in trying to sway others to his side and mockingly referred to him as the doppelganger. Lee was caught off guard by this sudden turn of events, but before he could respond, Yoonjin shouted, declaring there was nothing more to discuss and urging everyone to attack the fake Lee and eliminate the rest of the doppelgangers. Seong, however, immediately objected, saying such reckless accusations were absurd and warning that her logic would imply he was a fake as well, which he was not. Yizal intervened, cautioning against jumping to conclusions based on only one perspective. Junho supported Yisol's stance, emphasizing the need for caution. Yoonjin, growing frustrated, argued that there was no time for such deliberation, as a massive disaster was only minutes away. Amid the chaos, Lee reflected on the unexpected turn of events, thinking that praising his doppelganger was almost like praising himself. He acknowledged that his doppelganger had made the best possible move in the current situation. Resolving to act, Lee stepped forward and admitted to everyone that the doppelganger was correct. He was the one who had killed Junsung. The doppelganger, caught off guard, questioned if Lee had given up and expressed disappointment, saying he had expected more resistance. However, Lee knew something the doppelganger did not. Junsung had been a traitor who had been killing players from the very beginning. With that thought fueling his resolve, Lee surged forward and slashed across Junsung's doppelganger's chest in a decisive strike. As Lee slashed Junsung, he declared to everyone that the real Junsung had been a traitor. The doppelganger, stunned by Lee's actions, shouted in anger, demanding to know what Lee was doing and accusing him of acting recklessly now that he had run out of words. Junho, hearing Lee's statement about Junsung, was puzzled and questioned why Lee would accuse Junsung of being a traitor. Junho began to piece things together, realizing that if his suspicions were correct, the one who had just attacked Junsung was indeed the real Lee. He also recognized that by gathering everyone in one place, Lee had already shifted the odds in the player's favor. When a doppelganger killed someone, their true nature was immediately exposed, making it impossible for the doppelgangers to act recklessly in the current situation. Junho also considered that if Lee could identify the doppelganger, he could easily prove himself as the real Lee by eliminating one of them. Yet, he remained confused about why Lee had claimed Junsung was a traitor. Unable to hold back, he raised his voice and asked Lee if Junsung had killed humans. Lee, hearing the question, confirmed Junho's suspicions and explained that Junsung had been a demon hiding behind the mask of a good person, concealing his true nature and patiently biding his time. Yunji, upon hearing this, was overcome with anger. To her, Junsung had always been a trusted ally who had supported her throughout their time together. Enraged by Lee's accusations, she confronted him, demanding to know how he could dare insult Junsung in such a way. In her fury, she swung her sword at Lee, declaring that she would never forgive him for what he had said. As Yunji spoke, she was suddenly struck by an arrow in her back. Shocked and betrayed, she turned to see that the attacker was none other than Junsung, the person she had trusted the most. Collapsing to the ground, she succumbed to her injuries as the system announced that a player had died, reducing the number of players to 12 and leaving 11 doppelgangers. The unexpected turn of events left everyone stunned. Even Lee was momentarily taken aback, having not anticipated that Junsung's doppelganger would still have the strength to act after being slashed. Junsung's doppelganger erupted into a fit of laughter, reveling in the chaos and declaring that the expressions of shock and betrayal were exactly what he had hoped to see. Before he could gloat further, Sechang struck from behind, delivering a swift and decisive attack that killed the doppelganger instantly. The system immediately announced that a doppelganger had died, further shifting the tension among the group. Sechang apologized to Lee for doubting him and asked what they should do next. Lee was taken aback by Sechang's sudden trust, while the other players were still reeling from the revelation that Junsung had truly been a doppelganger. However, with this confirmation, they still couldn't definitively identify the real Lee. At that moment, the remaining doppelgangers, realizing their deception had been uncovered, drew their swords, prepared to fight against the players. The players, turning to Lee, asked for guidance, pledging to follow his lead. Hearing their words, Lee was momentarily lost in thought, recalling a moment from his past that made this situation feel eerily like déjà vu. Snapping back to the present, he stepped forward and addressed everyone, announcing that he would reveal his final plan to the players. As Lee was about to speak, his doppelganger suddenly appeared from behind and declared that it was now all or nothing. Without hesitation, the doppelganger swung his sword at Lee, but Lee reacted swiftly, blocking the attack. While clashing with his doppelganger, Lee defiantly stated that he would take all the gold the doppelganger had amassed and use it to raise his own stats. He added that the same fate awaited the rest of the doppelgangers. Inspired by Lee's determination, the real players began to overpower their opponents. The doppelgangers, no longer able to match the strength and resolve of the players, faltered. Each player had grown stronger than they were the day before, and their unity and newfound strength turned the tide of the battle decisively in their favor. After a few moments, the players managed to eliminate all the doppelgangers. As they rested, exhausted from the battle, Lee reflected on the situation. He realized that the doppelgangers' stats had remained the same as when the players first entered the second floor. Their ability to raise their stats with gold had been the key to clearing the mission without further casualties. While Lee was lost in thought, Sechang's voice cut through the quiet. Frustrated and disappointed, Sechang expressed his anger, blaming the traitor Junsung for their loss, insisting that without him, everyone could have survived. Hearing this, Lee considered that Sechang was likely the most affected, given that he had been in the same party as Junsung. Lee couldn't help but share the sentiment. Despite their success, he felt the weight of his own disappointment, as his ultimate goal had been to clear the second floor without losing a single player. Lee reflected that the situation in other regions was likely far worse than theirs, as those groups lacked someone like him with the ability to read a guide. He considered the possibility that, just like Junsung, there might be others who had chosen the path of the Star Killer. Lee anticipated that the battles ahead would become even more intense, but despite his current weakness, he felt certain that there was a purpose behind his unique ability to read the guide. He acknowledged that not everything he had experienced so far had been positive, but as long as there were people who trusted him, Lee resolved to do his best to save as many lives as possible. While deep in thought, Sechang approached him, expressing gratitude and saying that he had survived because of Lee. Lee, however, responded humbly, attributing their success to everyone working together and following his plan. Sechang then pointed out to Lee that despite his significant contributions, Lee remained at level 2. This, Sechang reasoned, must mean that Lee had been granted a special ability in exchange for the slowing of his leveling progress. Lee was surprised that Sechang had figured this out so quickly. As he processed this, Lee thought to himself that Sechang's cautiousness and decision-making skills were certainly impressive. He realized that Sechang would be a valuable asset in the future. In that moment, Sechang bowed his head in front of Lee, sincerely apologizing for having doubted and looked down on him. Seeing this, the rest of the players followed suit, bowing their heads and offering their apologies as well. Lee, visibly troubled by the gesture, quickly told everyone not to apologize to him. As Lee was speaking, Seong suddenly burst into laughter, telling everyone that they were all terrible at recognizing someone's potential. He added that they should have followed his example and hopped onto Lee's express train. Just as Seong spoke, Yizal stepped forward, asserting that she had been the first to recognize how extraordinary Lee was. Junho, with tears in his eyes, also joined the conversation, offering his heartfelt apology to Lee once again. Lee, hearing all of this, began to feel increasingly troubled and irritated by the attention. At that moment, Sechang spoke up once more, acknowledging that his request might seem shameless after everything that had happened, but he still asked Lee to lead them all from that point onward. Lee was initially surprised by Sechang's request, but after a moment of reflection, he smiled and accepted the proposal. A few moments later, the system finished calculating the gold rewards based on each player's contribution. Everyone was thrilled and excited to receive their gold, but Seong couldn't contain his excitement. He proudly declared that he had been rewarded with 2,000 gold and continued bragging about it to everyone. Watching the others celebrate, Lee thought to himself that it seemed like everyone had earned some gold by following his plan. He was pleased that they had all benefited, but what excited him even more was the fact that he had earned 12,500 gold coins. As the one who had contributed the most to the mission, Lee couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. As Lee was browsing his shop, the system announced that, because he had obtained more than 10,000 gold coins, his shop rank would increase. In that moment, new items appeared in the shop. Lee observed the changes and realized how the system worked. He understood that to purchase rare or higher level items, he would need to continue increasing his shop rank. Lee decided that his next purchase would be for the skill up item. As he did so, his skill up increased to level 3, and his basic swordsmanship also leveled up. Upon seeing this, Lee reflected on the past when he had unknowingly used a higher level of swordsmanship but had fainted shortly afterward. Now, though, he thought that being able to access such a powerful skill for just 5,000 gold coins seemed like an incredibly cheap price to pay for such strength. After a few moments, Lee finished his shopping. As he was about to leave, he saw Yizal and immediately gave her 1,200 gold coins. Yizal was taken aback by this gesture and asked Lee why he had given her the gold. Lee simply told her that she could keep the coins. He then explained that when they fought the kobolds and the doppelgangers, it would have been much harder for them to win without Yisol's help. Lee added that in a place where they were forced to take the lives of others to survive, the fact that they could still laugh, rely on each other, and help others was all thanks to her. Touched by Lee's words, Yizal felt tears welling up in her eyes. With her voice trembling, she promised Lee that she would become stronger so that she could help others even more. In that moment, her healing hand skill leveled up. At that moment, Lee handed 200 gold coins to Seong. Seong, confused by the gesture, looked at Lee, who told him to stop doing weird things and to keep up the good work. As Lee said this, he thought to himself that Seong had become quite competent, and with a little help from him, Seong might become even stronger. Lee also considered that it was better to avoid having annoying people on his bad side. Just as he was thinking this, a beam of light suddenly shone from Seong. When Lee looked back, he saw Seong acting cute, almost on the verge of tears. Seong then declared that Lee's wish would be his command from then on. Seeing Seong's exaggerated, cute expression, Lee was suddenly filled with frustration. In that moment, he felt the urge to test his level 3 basic swordsmanship on Seong. A few moments later, everyone arrived on the third floor, and the mission for the floor began. The system then announced that the third floor's mission was a siege war. It would be their first time encountering players from other regions. The objective to complete the mission was to bring down the castle and occupy the altar present on the floor. They were given 24 hours to complete the task, but the penalty for failing the mission was not disclosed. After the announcement, each player received a return crystal, a time-limited item that could only be used on the third floor. One of the players asked if they had to kill other people, while another inquired about the purpose of the return crystal. As everyone observed the situation, Lee suddenly noticed something and, upon realizing it, immediately called out to Seong. He reminded Seong that Seong had promised to do anything for him. With that, Lee drew his sword, and Seong, seeing this, became terrified. Moments later, Seong was running uphill, muttering to himself that Lee was going too far. He added that Lee should have just used his words instead, as Seong knew that even if he were to be killed, he wouldn't actually die, he would just be returned to the starting location. Lee had figured this out thanks to the guidebook he possessed, which explained that on the third floor, the return crystal would return a player to the starting location if they were to die. Seong, remembering that Lee had promised him 100 gold coins for doing reconnaissance for the team, felt a surge of motivation. Standing in front of the door, he shouted that he was going to destroy everything on the third floor. With that, Seong began delivering powerful blows to the door, determined to break it open. The system then informed him that with each punch, the castle gate's durability was gradually decreasing. After a few more strikes, Seong delivered a final blow, and the castle gate was finally breached. At that moment, the system alerted him that there were only 2 seconds left before the gate would reset. True to the system's warning, after 2 seconds, the gate restored itself. After entering the castle, Seong thought to himself that there was no way a mere castle gate could withstand his power. As he surveyed his surroundings, he noticed 2 guards on top of the castle wall and, in the distance, around 10 people standing near the altar. Seong then remembered what Lee had told him: he should not kill anyone because the others would figure out the purpose of the return crystal. While Lee had advised him to avoid causing trouble, Seong thought that the people in front of him were nothing more than trash, weak and terrified of him. Determined, he told himself that he would destroy them all. However, before he could act, he was suddenly struck by a powerful attack to the face. Blood began to drip from his wound as he staggered back in shock. Seong, lying on the floor, wondered what had just happened to him. As he looked forward, he saw a person holding a gun aimed directly at him, and in that moment, he died. A few moments later, Seong had returned to the team and shared everything about what had happened. Lee was surprised to hear that someone had a gun, and Seong explained that the gun fired a magic bullet that caused a great deal of pain. Lee, deep in thought, found the situation baffling. A gun was not a weapon that could be obtained at that point in time. Even Sachang, whose class was soldier, didn't have access to such a weapon. But then, Lee considered another possibility. The person with the gun might have obtained it through the benefits of the second floor, where completing the job as a star killer would reward a legendary piece of equipment. Lee, deep in thought about the upcoming tough fight, was interrupted by Yizal, who held his shoulders and reassured him that she had his back. As she spoke, all the other players raised their voices in unison, expressing their support and telling Lee that they were behind him as well. Lee, feeling a surge of happiness at their enthusiasm, nodded and declared that he would now share the plan they would follow. As time passed, night fell, and inside the castle, a man knelt on the floor, on the verge of tears. A woman sat atop him, using him as a chair, while all the other players stood frozen in fear, unable to move or act. Moments later, Lee was no longer near the castle. As he stood there, he reflected on the great benefit he had gained during the second floor's mission: impeccable senses. With this ability, he could spot individuals from a great distance. Using his skill, he observed the 2 guards stationed on top of the castle walls near the gate. As Lee continued scanning the area, Seong suddenly stepped forward and shouted at the guards, declaring that they had met once again. Yizal, noticing this, turned to Lee and expressed concern that if Seong went back there, the enemies would figure out what the return crystals were for. Lee, however, reassured her, explaining that while the enemies might suspect something, they wouldn't be certain. It was more likely they would think that only Seong had the ability to use the return crystal in that way. At that moment, the two guards shot their arrows at Seong, and he was taken by surprise, as the situation was different from the first time he had come. But just as the arrows were about to hit, Lee appeared and sliced them in half. He then turned to Yizal and explained that, since the enemies didn't fully understand how Seong was able to return from the dead, they now had an opportunity to strike. With that, Lee stepped onto Seong's shoulders and launched himself upward toward the guards. As he closed the distance, Lee swiftly slashed them across the chest, causing significant damage. Meanwhile, Junho called out to the group, reminding them that the enemies would eventually figure out how to use the return crystal, especially after the failed attack in the first round. Therefore, it was crucial that they defeat the enemies quickly this time. Seong, seeing the opportunity, shouted for everyone to charge at the castle, urging them to take advantage of this chance. He also mentioned that with just 5 of his stone fists, he could destroy the gate and instructed everyone to follow closely behind him, warning that the gate would close if they were too slow to enter. But just as Seong was about to deliver a powerful blow to the gate, he was shot again through the door by a gun, the bullet striking him directly in the chest. The system then announced that the gate's durability had been destroyed by a single attack and could no longer be restored. Yizal quickly cast her healing magic on Seong, urging him to pull himself together. Lee, still processing the situation, observed his team when one of the guards, lying on the ground, spoke up. He told Lee that he didn't understand why Lee had spared the two of them but warned that such a mindset would cost them their lives. The guard then warned Lee that if he maintained such a kind mindset, the woman holding the gun would take advantage of it. Lee, using his skill to check her stats, was shocked by what he found. He had only considered the possibility of her being a threat, but upon looking at her stats, he saw that her name was Sun Seoyeon, and she was indeed a star killer. He was further surprised to see that Seoyeon was already level 13, leading him to wonder if she had slaughtered everyone on the second floor. As Lee was processing the situation, Seoyeon fired her gun at him, hitting him in the shoulder and causing significant damage. Lee quickly took cover, drinking a healing potion to recover his health. He was surprised, as he hadn't expected Seoyeon to shoot at him from such a long distance. Lee realized at that moment that the woman was far more hostile than he had initially thought and showed no hesitation in her actions. He felt relieved that he had prepared beforehand and was wearing Kala's leather armor, which provided him some protection. As Lee observed her mana stats, he saw that each magic bullet she fired consumed 10 MP. He deduced that if she were using the same rank shop as he was, she wouldn't yet be able to purchase mana recovery items. With that in mind, Lee descended from the tower, thinking to himself that if this was the case, Seoyeon only had 13 more magic bullets left. He realized that he and his team had to break through quickly before she ran out of ammo. 30 minutes earlier, one of the players had asked Lee how they were going to get past the bullets to reach the altar. Sachang responded, suggesting they find cover and advance in a zigzag pattern. Lee then added that the woman wouldn't be able to fire bullets capable of bringing Seong to the verge of death immediately. Since the bullet was a magic bullet, it would likely consume MP. Junho agreed, pointing out that the amount of MP the woman had left would be crucial. Lee agreed with Junho's assessment and advised everyone to be prepared to tank at least one bullet. Back in the present, when the bullet hit one of the players, he smiled, having been protected by his armor. Everyone then began charging toward the woman, and as they did, she fired a barrage of bullets in their direction. As Seoyeon observed the situation, she realized she wouldn't be able to finish off all of her opponents with her gun alone. She ordered her team to stop the enemies, and they began charging toward Lee and his group. Lee, assessing the situation, thought to himself that what happened next would determine the outcome of the battle. He recognized that if a fight broke out, some of his teammates would likely die due to the magic bullets, so they needed to reach the altar as quickly as possible. As the battle raged on, Lee was able to deflect all of the attacks coming his way. However, just as he was focusing on the fight, a bullet suddenly shot toward him. At the last moment, the bullet was deflected by Junho, and Seoyeon was taken aback, surprised that they could block her magic bullets. Junho, seeing the opening, urged Lee to head for the altar quickly. But as he spoke, Junho was struck in the head by a bullet and was sent back to the starting point. Lee, consumed by fury at what he had just witnessed, observed the growing number of people falling in the battle. He realized that Seoyeon was fully aware that those she killed would return after death, yet she wore an expression that showed she didn't care, even if it meant taking lives. Lee's anger intensified at the sight of her indifference. As he was thinking about this, Seoyeon smiled to herself, finding the group she was fighting against quite interesting. Seeing her smile only fueled Lee's rage further. In a surge of emotion, he activated his level 3 basic swordsmanship, slashing through all the enemies in front of him. With a swift movement, he charged directly towards Seoyeon, and their weapons collided at the center of the altar, the clash echoing through the air. As the fight raged on, Seong informed his opponents that they were in serious trouble. His statement left them confused, uncertain about the reason behind his sudden declaration. Seong then clarified that now that Lee had reached the altar, he and his allies no longer needed to hold back. With that, Seong activated his level 2 stone fist, unleashing a powerful strike that sent all his opponents in front of him flying. Meanwhile, during a brief exchange between Lee and Seoyeon, Seoyeon expressed her disbelief at Lee's strength, remarking on how remarkable it was for someone at only level 2. She asked him who he truly was, but Lee shifted the conversation, pointing out that it was even more surprising for Seoyeon to already be at level 13. At that moment, Lee stepped onto the altar. The system immediately notified him that he had successfully occupied the altar, but it also indicated that 3 people were required to be present on the altar for it to be fully claimed. The system then informed Lee that he needed to remove the opposing player from the altar. Realizing this, Lee began to understand how they could fully occupy the altar. However, before taking action, he considered a plan to eliminate Seoyeon from the altar. While he was deep in thought, Seoyeon abruptly fired her gun at him. Lee reacted quickly, dodging the shot just in time. As he evaded the bullet, he launched a counterattack against Seoyeon, but she managed to block his strike. Their fight intensified as Seoyeon grew increasingly surprised by Lee's ability to evade her bullets with such precision. As their clash continued, she began to suspect that Lee might have been predicting her attacks, allowing him to react so effectively. At that moment, Lee recalled swordsman like Junho, one of the strongest players in their area. Junho had earned recognition as a genius table tennis player. In professional matches, especially during intense rallies, returning every ball wasn't something one could achieve using sight alone. At higher levels of play, players often read their opponent's posture or where they were looking to anticipate the ball's trajectory. The ability to predict the ball's direction with such accuracy was extraordinary, earning Junho the nickname, the genius of prediction, during his professional career. Reflecting on this, Lee realized how he could apply Junho's special ability to his own situation. Drawing on this insight, Lee was able to evade all of Seoyeon's attacks with precision. At the same time, he delivered a powerful slash in her direction. Although Seoyeon remained standing, Lee had successfully landed a decisive hit on her. Seoyeon grew increasingly irritated with Lee, fully aware that his stats were higher than hers. At that moment, Sechang and the others arrived, informing Lee that they had dealt with their opponents. Seong added that they should end the fight quickly before their defeated foes could return. Hearing Seong's words, Seoyeon was surprised to learn that the function of the return crystal was revival. Lee confirmed her realization but dismissed its importance, stating it was irrelevant for her to know now. Lee then considered the situation carefully. Even if Seoyeon had a hidden skill that allowed her to land a single decisive strike, he was confident in his ability to endure the hit. Resolving to take the risk, he decided to press forward, determined to end the fight immediately. As Lee powered up his sword, Seoyeon asked if he truly believed he had already won. In that moment, she began using her gold coins to level up her firing skills, increasing them to level 4. Realizing the danger, Lee immediately understood that he was in trouble and needed to end the fight quickly. He charged towards Seoyeon with determination, but, before he could strike, she fired her bullets. The shots hit Lee perfectly, annihilating him and sending him back to the starting point of the 3rd floor. The system then announced to everyone that the 3rd floor mission had ended. Moments later, Lee found himself back at the castle. Standing before him was Seong, who looked visibly sad. Seeing this, Lee asked why Seong was wearing such an expression. Lee remarked that they had won the battle and asked Seong why he still looked sad. Seong explained that although he had carried the mission this time, he was disappointed by the meager gold rewards. Hearing this, Lee smiled faintly at Seong's complaint. Reflecting on the battle, Lee thought about how he had not anticipated Seoyeon's sudden escalation at the end. However, he had managed to stab Seoyeon with his sword at the same moment her bullet struck him. As he delivered the blow, Seoyeon had told him that she would remember his name. Afterward, Yizal, Sechang, and Seong successfully occupied the altar, securing their victory in the mission. Lee found himself thinking about Seoyeon again, recalling how she gave him an unsettling sense of unease. He hoped that their paths would never cross again. As he was lost in thought, Yizal interrupted, urging everyone to look at the gate that had just opened before them. When they turned their attention to it, they saw the group they had fought earlier standing behind the gate. The system announced that the defeated group would now face the disaster, targeting players who had not secured a single kill. In that instant, an unidentified monster of unknown level emerged and annihilated everyone on the other side of the gate. The players screamed for help, their desperate pleas echoing in the air. Yizal, moved by their cries, attempted to intervene, but as she touched the gate, it repelled her, preventing her from entering. Helpless, she had no choice but to stand by and watch as the entire group met their end. Everyone was stunned by the horrific scene, unable to do anything but stand in silence. After a few minutes, the system announced that only one player from the C-1427 area had survived and that the group had been reorganized. Hearing this, Lee was taken aback as he recalled that the only person who had managed to secure kills against him and his team was Seoyeon. As he pieced it together, a figure began to emerge from the gate. To everyone's shock, it was none other than Seoyeon herself. The system then declared that a new group had been created, leaving the players to process this unexpected turn of events. Moments later, the players found themselves on the 4th floor. One of them observed the surroundings and noted that it appeared to be an abandoned city. The system then announced that a disaster would descend upon the cursed city in 6 hours. Their objective was to eliminate all the monsters that would appear throughout the city and secure an escape portal. The system explained that the escape portals would spawn randomly as the players hunted the monsters, with only 20 portals available in total. It also emphasized that players were prohibited from allowing others to use their portals. The mission had to be completed within the 6-hour time limit. The players, upon hearing the announcement, were filled with excitement. One of them remarked that it was finally time for a monster hunting mission, expressing relief and enthusiasm after the grueling challenges of the 2nd and 3rd floors. He admitted he was glad to finally face monsters instead of other players. Another player pointed out that with 20 escape portals and only 13 people in the group, there was no need for competition among them. Seong chimed in, declaring that the situation was perfect for him. He confidently stated his intention to eliminate every monster on the 4th floor, encouraging everyone to seize the opportunity to level up by hunting as many monsters as they could. At that moment, Yizal interrupted Seong, who was still excited, and pointed out that since the system had specified they couldn't allow others to use their own portals, the number of monsters appearing on the 4th floor would likely be much lower. She explained that there would be a limit to how many monsters could appear. Junho then spoke up, agreeing with Yisol's assessment. He added that if one person opened multiple portals, some players might not be able to escape. He also cautioned that the extra portals could be a trap set by the tower. Sechang then suggested that no matter how many monsters they killed, it would make more sense to enter the portal as soon as it appeared. At this, Junho raised his voice, urging everyone to promise that once they found a portal, they would stop hunting and escape immediately from the 4th floor. Everyone, upon hearing Junho's suggestion, agreed with him. However, Yizal noticed something odd about Seong's expression and asked him what was wrong with his face. Seong, startled by the question, quickly replied that there was nothing wrong with his face and that he had always looked this way. As Lee observed the team's progress, he reflected on how, after everything they had gone through together, it seemed like everyone had finally understood what needed to be done for the mission. He felt that they had truly become a team and decided that he would give his best effort as well. Just as he was thinking this, his expression shifted when he remembered one person in the group who wouldn't agree with their approach, Seoyeon. True to his thoughts, Seoyeon, with her arms crossed, questioned why she should follow their plan. As Seoyeon made her statement, she warned them not to give her orders, or she would kill them all. After saying this, she walked away, leaving behind a group of angry players who were clearly irritated by her words. Lee, observing the situation, thought to himself that they should gang up on Seoyeon and get rid of her. 12 hours earlier, Seong had confronted Seoyeon, telling her that this was no place for her to act so arrogantly. He added that without her gun, she would just be useless trash. But before he could finish, Seoyeon punched him square in the face, sending him flying to the ground. Everyone was shocked by what she had done and taken aback by her surprising strength. Seoyeon, standing over Seong, told him not to act as if he had multiple lives, and she called him trash as she walked away. As Seoyeon spoke to Seong, Lee interrupted her, telling her that she was now in their territory and needed to stop messing around. As Lee moved closer to Seoyeon, he couldn't help but reflect on everything he had gone through at the beginning, all to eliminate a potential star killer like Junsung. He never expected that a real star killer would appear before him, and on top of that, Seoyeon was skilled in combat even without her gun. While Lee was thinking about this, Seoyeon calmly remarked that they had met again. Hearing this, Lee responded by asking if she had something to say to him. He added that he didn't believe they were in a position to exchange polite greetings. As Lee spoke to Seoyeon, he suddenly felt an overwhelming sense of danger coming from her. Instinctively, he backed away, and just as he did, the system popped up, informing him that Seoyeon, the star killer, had designated him as her main target. Lee, seeing this notification, was confused about what it meant. As he pondered this, the system displayed a guide, and Lee was shocked by what he saw. Meanwhile, Seoyeon walked away, her eyes filled with irritation and rage directed at them. A short time later, Seong was seen fighting an orc. As he delivered the final blow, he apologized to the orc for hitting its handsome face and, at the same time, told the orc to become his experience points. With its last breath, the orc wondered why a fellow orc was attacking it, before it passed away. As soon as the orc died, a portal appeared next to its body, and Seong was surprised to see it so soon, considering he had only killed a few monsters. While he was thinking about how to handle the situation, Lee suddenly appeared in front of him, causing Seong to jump in surprise. Seong, startled, asked what Lee was doing there. Lee, noticing Seong's shocked expression, asked why Seong was so surprised to see him and whether he had done something wrong to cause such a reaction. Seong, panicking, nervously laughed and claimed that wasn't the case. He explained that he had just thought Lee had opened the portal. However, Lee didn't believe a word of it and told Seong he knew Seong had opened the portal. Hearing this, Seong thought to himself that Lee was a quick-witted brat, but before he could dwell on it further, Lee told him to stop the nonsense and kicked him straight into the portal. After sending Seong through the portal, Lee muttered to himself that he had known Seong was up to no good. He thought that while one problem was taken care of, another still loomed, Seoyeon. Lee then remembered what the guide had shown him. The system had informed him that Seoyeon's traits as a star killer would be fully unlocked on the Day of the Blood. On that day, if Lee were to be killed by the star killer, Seoyeon would receive a substantial reward. The system had advised Lee to level up as much as possible in preparation for the Day of the Blood. Recalling the system's warning, Lee thought to himself that although he didn't know when the Day of the Blood would arrive, it was likely to be an event that heavily favored the star killer, and many people would certainly die. He knew he needed to take action before that day came. As Lee was deep in thought, a level 10 orc suddenly appeared before him. Just as the orc prepared to attack, Lee delivered a powerful slash, instantly killing it. As he observed the orc's demise, Lee thought to himself that he needed to become as strong as possible before the Day of the Blood. However, after killing the orc, Lee noticed that the portal didn't appear as it had with other monsters. He realized that even though he could defeat all the monsters on the floor, he wouldn't have enough time to kill them all, especially since not everyone had escaped yet. He also reminded himself to stay cautious of Seoyeon, who was likely out there hunting monsters as well. Lee began to think about how to approach the situation, knowing that time was limited and the stakes were high. As Lee walked around searching for monsters, he suddenly caught a whiff of a rotten stench. Curious about the source, he wondered where the smell was coming from. At that moment, the system notified him that while orcs had a distinct stench, those that left behind a portal emitted a much stronger odor. Relieved, Lee realized he had finally found an orc that would create a portal. Without hesitation, he charged at the orc and delivered a powerful slash, killing it instantly. As he did, a portal appeared beside the orc's body. Lee smiled upon seeing this, pleased with the outcome. A few moments later, Lee found himself standing in front of Seoyeon. With a confident expression, he made a playful remark, asking why he seemed so unlucky, as he still hadn't found a portal yet. Seoyeon, looking somewhat troubled by his behavior, asked him if he was truly this unlucky. Upon hearing Seoyeon's question, Lee replied that he had never won anything in life, and that random luck-based missions were the worst kind for him. As he spoke, Lee thought to himself that while he had intentionally avoided the orcs that would open portals, Seoyeon needed him to kill the orcs, since she had to eliminate him on the Day of the Blood. Therefore, Seoyeon had no choice but to let Lee take care of the orcs. If Lee were to die without securing a portal, it would be bad for Seoyeon as well. However, Lee had already secured a portal, so he no longer had anything to worry about. Just then, the system notified Lee that a player had opened a portal, and there were now only 5 remaining escape portals. Lee thought to himself that the situation was shaping up well for him, and it seemed that the other players were managing to escape smoothly as well. Lee, at that moment, pretended to be in trouble and told Seoyeon that there were only 5 portals remaining. However, as he said this, Seoyeon grew furious with his behavior and told him to shut up and focus on finding a portal. Seeing the anger on her face, Lee immediately retreated, scared, and agreed with her. Time passed, and Lee continued killing orcs that weren't supposed to open portals. As he did so, he thought to himself that every time he struck down an orc, he felt both sorry and pleasantly refreshed. He added that these contradictory feelings reminded him of his relationship with Seoyeon. He couldn't believe that, in that moment, he had actually seen her worried face about him not being able to find a portal to escape. In that moment, Lee turned to Seoyeon and told her that he was the one who had not found a portal yet, so he asked her why she seemed the one who was anxious. Seoyeon, upon hearing that, quickly changed her expression and told him that she was not anxious at all about him not finding a portal. Lee then told Seoyeon to tell him how many portals she had opened, and Seoyeon revealed that she had already opened 5 portals for herself. Upon hearing this, Lee thought to himself that she had already opened a lot of portals for herself, but it was still within the buffer. With 5 portals for Seoyeon and 1 for Lee, he figured that if each of the remaining 11 people opened 1 portal, there would still be a total of 3 portals left. At that moment, Lee thought that perhaps the only ones left on the 4th floor now were just the 2 of them. Lee at that moment thought to himself that it was time for him to split up with Seoyeon since there were only 10 minutes left. He then acted shocked and told Seoyeon that there were only 10 minutes left. He said that he would go find a portal on his own and advised her to go ahead and use one of the portals she had already opened. Just as Lee was about to separate from Seoyeon, she suddenly told him to stop. Upon hearing this, Lee went into a state of panic, fearing that Seoyeon had realized what he was trying to do. He quickly asked her if she had any more business with him and reminded her that there were less than 10 minutes left. He urged her to go to a portal to escape, but Seoyeon then spoke to him in a low tone. Unfortunately, Lee couldn't hear what she was saying. Lee, observing Seoyeon's strange behavior, thought to himself that something was off about her. He realized that he needed to get out of there quickly, but just as he was about to move, Seoyeon ran up to him. Lee immediately drew his sword, expecting an attack, but instead, Seoyeon grabbed his clothes and shyly admitted that she had forgotten the locations of the portals she had opened. Lee was surprised by her confession and, in that moment, realized that Seoyeon had no sense of direction. A short time later, Lee managed to escape through a portal and regroup with his team. Seong, with a happy expression, came running toward him, excited to have finally arrived. However, just as Seong was about to hug Lee, Lee landed a powerful punch right on his face, sending him flying backward. After delivering the powerful punch to Seong, Lee told himself that Seong had frightened him. He thought that his mission was not yet complete, especially after seeing Seong. At that moment, Seoyeon approached Lee and remarked that, come to think of it, Seong resembled an orc. Lee, hearing this, quickly responded that she didn't need to say that out loud. Just then, Yaezal arrived and told Seoyeon that she had made it back safely. Junho, relieved, told Seoyeon that despite her being their enemy in the past, she was now their teammate. He added that he looked forward to working with her from then on. As he spoke, he extended his hand for a handshake, but Seoyeon, without turning to face him, simply told him that he was being very noisy. Seong, clutching his nose which was dripping with blood from Lee's punch, called Seoyeon a little wench and remarked that she should have been left behind on the 4th floor to die. Seoyeon, unbothered, retorted by calling Seong a pig and told him to shut his mouth. In response, Seong, furious, shot back that it wasn't about speed but about muscle. As the two continued to argue, Lee found himself wondering if he should have left Seoyeon behind on the 4th floor. However, he quickly dismissed the thought, realizing it wouldn't make sense for the Star Killer, blessed by the system, to perish just from getting lost. He decided to take this as an opportunity to make Seoyeon indebted to him, though he couldn't forget how she had acted when she had lost track of her portals. Lee reminded himself to stay cautious around her. Lee, thinking that Seoyeon wouldn't take any action until the day of the blood, felt it should be fine for now. But just as he was contemplating this, a voice echoed, remarking that everyone seemed to be getting a little too comfortable. The voice surprised everyone, as it belonged to none other than Kumkum, who was standing proudly. However, before anyone could react, Kumkum's head was suddenly blown off. It was Seoyeon who had done it, using her gun. She calmly asked the rabbit why he was here again. The group, witnessing the shocking scene, was left in complete disbelief, unable to comprehend that Seoyeon had just shot Kumkum without warning. However, in that moment, Kumkum suddenly appeared in front of Seoyeon and remarked that Seoyeon had given such an intense greeting despite not having seen each other for a while. Before Seoyeon could respond, Kumkum launched a powerful attack that sent her flying backwards. Seoyeon crashed against the wall, badly injured. Lee, witnessing this, was surprised at how easily Kumkum had sent Seoyeon flying. But as Lee thought it over, he realized that if he had considered Kumkum's stats, it was possible that Kumkum had gone easy on Seoyeon. After all, Seoyeon was a star killer, and star killers were significant in the tower. Kumkum, standing back, reminded itself to calm down, acknowledging that it was still too early to finish the job. In that moment, Kumkum let out an evil laugh and informed all the players that it was not yet time for them to proceed to the next mission. Kumkum then told everyone that before they moved on to the next floor, it would change the lobby's background. As the background shifted, Lee was surprised to see that it had transformed into a library. Kumkum, with an evil smile, addressed the players and explained that from now on, each of them would need to choose one book. With a sinister grin, Kumkum added that the book could either be one that would help them survive or one that would lead to their death, depending entirely on their decision. Players were warned to choose their books wisely. Seong shouted that he would not let a mere book decide his fate, while Junho, on the other hand, was thinking about whether he would become stronger if he found a sword technique manual. Kumkum then added that they were not allowed to reveal the contents of their books to anyone, and that all the books would disappear once the 5th mission began. Kumkum told them it hoped they would all choose a book they would not regret, and with that, it disappeared again. One of the players expressed confusion, wondering if that was all Kumkum had to say, while another player told the rest to start searching for the book they would need. As everyone searched through the books, Lee was thinking to himself that it seemed like everyone was focusing on categories related to their classes. He guessed that it was to be expected, as it would be a waste of time to look for something else in this situation. However, just as he was thinking about this, the guidebook popped up and told Lee to choose a book titled, SSS Rank Returner's Monopoly of Connections, from the novels section. Lee was confused upon seeing this, as the guidebook was suggesting a book that was not related to his class at all, and he wondered why it would suggest he waste his time on a novel instead. Lee was in a state of shock as he looked at the book in his hands. The title alone seemed utterly useless, leaving him doubtful about its value. Despite his initial impression, Lee reminded himself that the book had been recommended for a reason. Deciding not to judge prematurely, he resolved to read it before forming any conclusions. As he opened the first page, he was disheartened to discover that the book contained a story resembling one of those generic, mass-produced fantasies. Glancing at the books chosen by Yizal, Seong, and Junho, he noticed they had picked remarkable volumes that granted them fascinating and powerful skills. At that moment, Lee couldn't help but feel as though he had already lost. Regret began to creep in, and he wondered if he should have chosen a sword technique or martial arts manual instead. While he was immersed in his thoughts, a loud noise behind him startled him. He quickly turned around, only to see Sachang, who was grinning with excitement while setting up a tent. Confused and intrigued, Lee found himself wondering what kind of book Sachang had chosen to aid him. At that moment, Lee began to wonder why he could still hear the banging noise even though Sachang had stopped building the tent. Turning his attention to the source of the sound, he was surprised to see Seoyeon. She looked visibly irritated and furious, muttering under her breath about how she would definitely kill Kumkum the next time she encountered the rabbit. On the ground before her lay a rabbit doll, which she was repeatedly striking with a hammer and nail. In her other hand, she held a book that appeared to be cursed, its dark aura adding to the unsettling scene. Watching Seoyeon in such a state, Lee quietly turned away, deciding it was best to avoid her for the time being. He had no desire to deal with her when she was this frightening. Moments later, a system notification appeared before everyone, announcing that time was up and they would all be moved to the 5th floor. In an instant, all the adventurers were teleported to a different location. They found themselves seated in a classroom, wearing school uniforms. To their surprise, a few other adventurers in the room appeared frozen in time, completely motionless as if the moment had been paused for them. One of the adventurers remarked that it felt as though they had all become younger, and another quickly agreed with the observation. Sachang, however, was far from pleased. The muscles he had worked so hard to build were gone, leaving him skinny and unimpressive. Seong, upon seeing Sachang's appearance, burst into laughter and teased him, calling him as thin as an anchovy. Lee, observing the scene, began to wonder if they had been reverted to their student days to match the mission's background. As his gaze shifted, he noticed that Seong looked almost the same as before, except he was now bald. Turning to Yizal, Lee couldn't help but think she looked just as good as she had when she was younger. However, when Lee looked at Seoyeon, he was taken aback. As a school student, she had a completely different aura, one that was both surprising and striking. Just as Lee was studying her, Seoyeon noticed his gaze and grew angry. Grabbing her spectacles, she crushed them in her hand and demanded to know why Lee was staring at her. As Seoyeon spoke, she quickly turned away from Lee, her face flushed with embarrassment. Lee, on the other hand, thought to himself that Seoyeon looked almost the same as she did now, the only difference being the glasses she wore, likely due to poor eyesight in the past. At that moment, a sudden announcement echoed through the room, addressing the adventurers and asking if they were cherishing the return to their youth. As soon as they heard the voice, everyone immediately recognized it as none other than Kumkum. Kumkum then revealed the details of the 5th floor mission, explaining that it was a role-playing scenario. He informed them that they were now in another dimension where humans and monsters coexisted. From that point forward, all of the adventurers would take on the roles of cadets in an academy dedicated to training monster hunters. Kumkum went on to explain that over the next 4 days, quests would appear intermittently. Failure to complete these quests would result in facing a death mission. He urged them to give their utmost effort to avoid such a grim outcome. The adventurers were filled with worry upon learning that they had to complete the quests, knowing that even a single failure would send them to the death mission. Lee, reflecting on the situation, thought to himself that while he had managed to survive the death mission once, it would be almost impossible for a regular player to endure. Regret settled in as he told himself that if he had known this would happen, he should have chosen a sword technique manual instead of a seemingly useless novel. At that moment, Kumkum announced that it was time to grant them the memories necessary for the role-playing scenario. Instantly, a multitude of strange, white entities appeared and entered the adventurers one by one. Shortly afterward, the system confirmed that the required memories had been successfully implanted. Lee found the experience fascinating, marveling at how he and everyone else now carried 2 distinct sets of memories in their minds. As he delved into the newly received memories, he realized they perfectly aligned with the content he had read in the SSS rank returner's monopoly of connections. Kumkum then informed everyone that the quest would begin once the class ended, encouraging them to enjoy the present moment as much as they could. At that instant, time resumed, and the previously frozen people in the classroom began moving again. The teacher, now active, started speaking and began his lesson, addressing the students. Junho leaned over and whispered to Lee, pointing out that the frozen individuals were now moving. Lee, however, was lost in thought. He speculated that if they were in a novel, he and the other adventurers were likely just extras. His attention shifted to the person seated in front of him, a young man named Yanam. Lee concluded that Yanam was most likely the protagonist of this story. A returner who possessed knowledge of the future, Yanam used his foresight to monopolize connections with influential people and places. Armed with this advantage, he ultimately rose to become the strongest figure in the narrative. At that moment, the teacher addressed the class, asking if anyone wanted to try answering his question. He added that a correct answer would earn the student store points. Lee immediately recognized that the question was far beyond the level of an average student and thought to himself that it was originally meant for Yanam to answer. As Yanam prepared to respond, Lee interrupted and confidently provided the answer, stating that the material in question was known as Exion. He went on to explain that Professor Brown's team from Columbia University was currently conducting research on it. The entire class was taken aback, surprised that Lee had answered such a challenging question. The teacher, equally impressed, remarked to himself that he had not expected to find a genius like Lee among the students. At that moment, the system informed Lee that he had earned store points for correctly answering the teacher's question. A satisfied smile spread across Lee's face as he finally understood why the guide had recommended the novel to him. He realized that manuals for sword techniques or martial arts were unnecessary for situations like this. Smiling menacingly, Lee thought to himself that all the connections Yanam was aiming for would now belong to him. Moments later, the group was walking outside the academy. Seong, walking close to Lee, asked how he had managed to answer the teacher's question. Lee replied that the answer had been included in the memories given to him, even though he knew this was a lie he could not reveal. Impressed, Seong commented that Lee might have inherited a good character. In response, Lee smirked and told Seong to take his complaints to the tower if he was feeling jealous. Yizal interrupted their conversation and asked Lee if he had any idea when the quest would begin. Lee, recalling what he had read in the novel, thought to himself that it should be happening right about then. Just as the thought crossed his mind, the system appeared in front of everyone, announcing a new quest. The mission was to clear a dungeon that had appeared near the B-37 building of the academy. They were given a time limit of 60 minutes, and failure would result in being forced into the death mission. Lee immediately recognized the significance of the quest. He knew from the novel that the boss monster would drop an item of immense importance, one that would play a crucial role in the future. Originally, the item was supposed to go to Yanam, but Lee was determined not to let that happen. Resolute, Lee urged everyone to hurry and complete the mission without delay. The group quickly agreed, and together they began running toward the dungeon. Moments later, the system notified all the adventurers that they had entered the Orc Den dungeon. Yanam, already inside, was surprised to see Lee and the rest of the group also there. He immediately asked how they had discovered this place and managed to enter the dungeon. Without responding directly, Lee sprinted past Yanam and, with a single slash, defeated the orc blocking his path. Turning back, Lee addressed Yanam, stating that he was not the only one capable of finding such places. Yanam was taken aback by Lee's words and the confidence he displayed. As the group began battling the monsters within the dungeon, Yanam observed their movements carefully. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He couldn't understand how these cadets had found the dungeon, nor could he fathom their strength. What struck him most was Lee and Seoyeon, who stood out as being on an entirely different level from the others. Yanam admitted to himself that he wouldn't be able to forget people with such overwhelming power. Watching their performance, a troubling thought crossed his mind. They might just take what he had planned to claim for himself right out from under his nose. In that moment, Yanam summoned a spear and launched it toward the monsters, striking down several orcs with a single attack. Both Lee and Seoyeon were taken aback by Yeonam's impressive display of power. Seong, noticing Yeonam's weapon, turned to the others and asked what kind of weapon it was. Yizal remarked that it was incredibly powerful. Lee, however, thought to himself that this was typical of a protagonist. Seeing Yeonam in action firsthand, Lee realized that the man was even more overpowered than he had originally imagined. Lee understood that Yeonam wouldn't easily give up the dungeon's reward, and so he silently resolved that they would see who would come out on top and claim the prize. The system then updated the players, stating that they had 48 minutes and 20 seconds remaining, with 72 out of 100 monsters still to be defeated. Lee, assessing the situation, thought that with their current momentum, they would likely clear the quest without much trouble. However, he knew that to claim the dungeon's reward, they would need to defeat the most orcs in order to earn the right to challenge the boss monster. At that moment, Lee acknowledged that Yeonam was definitely stronger than him, but he also reminded himself that he was an expert when it came to finding monsters. With that in mind, he charged forward to attack the remaining monsters. Seoyeon, watching Lee pull ahead, felt a surge of irritation. She thought to herself that she might have been outmaneuvered by Lee's petty tricks before, but this time, it would be different. Lee quickly began eliminating the monsters in his vicinity, and Seoyeon and Yeonam joined the fight, effortlessly obliterating the rest of the enemies. The other players, watching the three of them fight, couldn't help but comment on their impressive abilities. As they observed, Yizal spoke up, noticing that Lee seemed to be acting more desperate than usual. Junho, teary-eyed as he watched Lee, turned to Yizal and said that Lee was showing them his noble heart. He was doing everything he could to keep the rest of the players from being sent to the death mission. However, Lee wasn't thinking about saving anyone. His sole focus was on claiming the dungeon reward. The rest of the players, seeing Lee's determination, began to tear up as they believed he was working so hard for them, to ensure they wouldn't be sent to the death mission. Junho, looking at the others, spoke up and reminded them that Lee had gone this far for them, the very ones who had voted him into the death mission, also they could survive. He added that he would fully embrace Lee's intentions for their sake. At that moment, the players were filled with renewed motivation. Junho encouraged them to work even harder from then on, for the sake of Lee, and everyone agreed with his words. Meanwhile, Lee, overhearing this, was confused by the others' reactions, unsure of why they were suddenly so motivated. Moments later, the system announced that the orc monsters had been exterminated and that the boss room had appeared. The players now stood before the entrance to the boss room. The system then informed everyone that the person who had earned the right to challenge the boss monster was Yeonam. Lee was taken aback by the announcement. He had done his best, but it still wasn't enough to surpass Yeonam. In that moment, he wondered what he should do next and whether he should just give up or find another way to claim victory. At that moment, Lee realized that things weren't going according to plan. He told himself he wasn't going to give up so easily. Determined, he called out to Yeonam and demanded that he give him the rights to challenge the boss monster. Yeonam, taken aback by Lee's request, asked him what he was suddenly talking about. Lee, without hesitation, replied, asking Yeonam if he wanted to know the way to end the chains of regression. Yeonam was visibly shocked by Lee's words. He pointed his spear at Lee and demanded to know who he was. Lee, unfazed, calmly told Yeonam to lower his spear. However, Yeonam refused and insisted on an answer, asking how Lee knew that he was a regressor. Lee, still calm, replied that it didn't matter how he knew about Yeonam's regression. Instead, he asked if Yeonam didn't want to see the winter that occurred when he was 32 years old. Hearing this, Yeonam was struck with surprise. In the past, a man told Yeonam that the starting point of his regression occurred in November when he was 17 years old. Yeonam agreed, and the man expressed envy for a life repeatedly relived during the prime years from 17 to 32. Yeonam, reflecting on his experience, told the man that he had always wanted to see the winter that occurred when he was 32 and added that he was tired of the cursed regression he had been trapped in. Back in the present, Lee spoke to Yeonam, telling him that if Yeonam allowed him to challenge the boss monster, Lee would reveal how to end the chains of regression. Yeonam, deep in thought, weighed his options. Meanwhile, Lee took advantage of the situation, knowing that Yeonam's greatest desire for millennia had been to escape the endless curse of regression. With no other choice, Yeonam had little option but to accept Lee's request. Yeonam then lowered his spear and warned Lee that if he was just fooling around, things would turn ugly for him. With that, Yeonam walked away. At that moment, the system announced that Yeonam had granted Lee the right to challenge the boss monster. Lee, now standing before the boss room, entered it, and the system informed everyone that Lee had entered the boss room. As Lee looked at the boss monster in front of him, he was taken aback. The creature appeared formidable, and for a moment, Lee felt a sense of fear creeping in. However, he quickly reminded himself to stay calm. He was in a novel, and while he didn't have information on the boss monster's level or the guide, Lee reassured himself that he already knew how to defeat it. Lee then focused on his first strategy, activating his skill, Impeccable Senses. As he did, the boss monster used its skill, Orc's Warrior Roar, which typically made most opponents lose the will to fight. However, thanks to Impeccable Senses, Lee's heightened awareness not only amplified his senses but also completely blocked out the effects of the roar. With a steady focus, Lee opened his eyes and told the monster that a mind attack relying on sound wouldn't work on someone like him. Then, without hesitation, he charged toward the monster. Next, Lee employed his second strategy. He knew that while the boss monster's upper body was as hard as steel, its lower body was far weaker. As the boss monster lunged at him, Lee dodged the attack and swiftly unleashed a series of strikes to the monster's vital points. Within moments, the boss monster collapsed, unable to stand. As the creature struggled on the ground, immobilized, Lee launched himself toward it and declared that the reward for its defeat would belong to him from that moment on. Seconds later, the system announced that the Orc Warrior had dropped an item and that Lee had completed the boss room. Moments after that, all the players returned to the academy, having finished the quest. Lee and Seong were seen playing rock, paper, scissors, betting their gold coins. Seong was growing furious after losing to Lee again, marking his 11th consecutive loss. He asked Lee if he was cheating, but Lee calmly replied that it was impossible to cheat in a game like this. He told Seong not to be absurd and simply hand over the gold coins they had bet. Though frustrated, Seong had no choice but to concede. Meanwhile, Junho, impressed, told Lee that he was incredible, even excelling at a game like rock, paper, scissors. Lee, however, was deep in thought, reflecting that there were only 2 mythical items mentioned in the novel. One of the mythical items was called Gingnur, which was Yeonam's weapon. It was an overpowered item that would always hit the target it was aimed at. The other mythical item was the Ring of Nikki, which Lee was currently wearing. The ring was of mythical grade and had the power to greatly increase the user's luck. It was an item that could not be shared with others. As Lee looked at the ring, he thought to himself that although its ability was simple, the ring was still an overpowered item, just as formidable as Gingnur. Lee realized that this item would become a very reliable form of insurance for the many turning points ahead. Lee also thought that while Yeonam would have to progress without the ring, he intended to give Yeonam the necessary information, since there was only one thing Yeonam truly wanted in the novel. As Lee was deep in thought, Seoyeon approached with an angry expression and interrupted him, telling him to play the game against her next. She thought to herself that the game was not just about luck but also a test of agility. With close to 50 agility stats, Seoyeon was confident that she would win against Lee. Lee then asked Seoyeon how much she was willing to bet, and Seoyeon responded that the bet would be for 3,000 gold. Seong, hearing the amount, was surprised as it was quite a lot, but Lee had other plans. With a serious expression, he suggested that they each bet 5,000 gold. After a moment, Seoyeon stared at the ground in disappointment, having just lost both the game and 5,000 gold to Lee. The next day, all of the students were standing in line outside the academy. Lee thought to himself that the time had finally come, the cliché scene that appeared in this kind of novel, the evaluation of strength by striking a punch machine. The teacher then instructed the students to use their own weapons to strike the crystal in front of them. By doing so, their magic power would be measured and displayed in values. The teacher then added that the points would be used when forming the dungeon practical groups 2 days from then. Junho, eager to see how the cadets measured up, commented that it was great, as he was curious about how strong everyone was. At that moment, one of the cadets was called up to strike the crystal. After doing so, He scored 43 points, and most of the cadets were impressed, praising him for his achievement. Junho told Lee that, judging from the reactions of the other cadets, that score seemed to be considerably high. Lee, recalling the injected memories, added that the first cadet was actually quite strong. The teacher then called for the next cadet, and it was Junho's turn. With confidence, Junho stepped forward and delivered a powerful strike, earning a total of 69 points. The other cadets were surprised by such a high score, not realizing that Junho was that strong. Junho, hearing the praise, confidently remarked that he had guessed he was pretty strong. Right after Junho finished his assessment, Seong stepped forward and told Junho to step aside, declaring that it was his turn. Seong added that when it came to punching machines, he was the best. With that, Seong delivered a powerful strike to the crystal, earning a total score of 75 points. The cadets were even more impressed, seeing that Seong had achieved such a high score using only his bare hands and not any weapons. As Seong stood there, soaking in the compliments from the other students, a bullet suddenly flew past him, striking the crystal and earning a total of 98 points. The attack came from none other than Seoyeon, and the cadets were left in disbelief. They couldn't fathom that a score of 98 was possible, and on top of that, Seoyeon had infused mana into her gun before shooting at the crystal, something none of them had thought to try. As Lee observed the expressions of the cadets, he couldn't help but feel proud. His teammates were clearly much stronger than the academy cadets. Just as Seoyeon finished her attack, another strike came in, achieving a score of 115. It was none other than Yeonam, and the moment Lee saw that, he realized that his teammates were stronger than most of the academy cadets, except for the protagonist. The cadets immediately began to praise Yeonam for his impressive score. Soon after, the students finished the assessment, and during lunch, Seong, with his mouth full, asked Lee why he hadn't tried for a better result. Lee replied that there was no point, as they wouldn't receive any rewards for it. Yizal, noticing Seong's clear speech despite his mouthful, commented on how impressive it was. Meanwhile, Junho, hearing Lee's response, remarked that he was starting to see Lee in a new light. As Lee ate his food, he thought to himself that he couldn't afford a high score. He needed to be in the same dungeon practical group as Yeonam, and a high score might make him one of the group leaders, which he wanted to avoid. As Lee was contemplating, the system suddenly appeared and announced that the second quest had started. Their mission was to rescue Yeonam, with a time limit of 1 hour, and the location was River Garden. Everyone was taken aback upon hearing the details of the second quest. Yizal, curious, asked if Yeonam was the strong cadet they had seen in the dungeon the previous day. Junho confirmed that she was right and wondered what had happened to Yeonam, speculating that he might have fallen into a trap. As the others discussed the mission, Lee, reflecting on his knowledge from the novel, began to piece together the situation. He recalled that after Yeonam's regression, he had taught a few thugs within the academy a lesson. One of these thugs was the only son of Park Yongsuk, the guild leader of Red Moon, one of the top 10 guilds. In response, Park Yongsuk had ordered his high-ranking hunters, his direct subordinates, to beat Yeonam to the brink of death. Lee remembered from the novel that Yeonam had gotten lucky and was rescued by someone, but now the situation had changed. With the ring of Nikki no longer in Yeonam's possession but in Lee's, the circumstances were different. That's all for today. Thanks for watching.